They found Duke Alexander Whitmore face down in the rubble with a steel pipe through his shoulder and blood pooling beneath expensive fabric now soaked black. The man who commanded armies, who dismissed his wife in front of 300 nobles without flinching, who never apologized for anything in his 32 years. That man was drowning in his own arrogance while London burned around him. But here's what nobody expected, what even he couldn't have imagined in his worst fever dreams. The hands that would pull him back from death belonged to the woman whose heart he'd shattered like cheap glass 3 years running, the woman he'd erased, the woman who had every reason to let him bleed out in the dirt. If you want to know whether mercy exists in a world this cruel, or whether some men deserve a second chance they'll never earn, stay with this. Because what happens next will crack you open. The Whitmore estate occupied 400 acres of Kent countryside, and every inch of it felt like a mausoleum to Evelyn Carter. She'd learned this within a week of becoming Lady Whitmore, back when she still believed proximity might breed affection, that sharing a name could eventually mean sharing a life. She was 21 then, stupid with hope. The wedding had been magnificent in the way only English nobility could manufacture magnificence. 700 guests, flowers imported from 3 countries, the Archbishop himself presiding over vows that tasted like ash in her mouth even as she spoke them. Alexander had looked at her exactly twice during the ceremony. Once when prompted by the officiant. Once when the contract required a kiss that landed somewhere near her cheekbone with all the warmth of a business transaction, which, she reminded herself in the carriage afterward while he stared out the window at nothing, was precisely what this was. The Carters needed Whitmore's military connections and royal favor. The Whitmores needed Carter's industrial wealth and political machinery. Evelyn and Alexander were simply the collateral, the blood sacrifice required to seal an agreement neither of them had authored. She told herself she could live with that. People had survived worse arrangements. At least Alexander was handsome in that brutal aristocratic way. Sharp cheekbones, cold gray eyes, the kind of face that looked carved rather than born. At least he wasn't actively cruel, just absent, just profoundly, devastatingly indifferent. She told herself that for 3 years, while the indifference calcified into something harder. The first year, Evelyn tried. God, how she tried. She learned his routines, memorized his preferences, appeared at breakfast in dresses he never noticed, and smiled at dinner parties where he introduced her with the enthusiasm of a man describing furniture. She waited up on nights when he worked late in his study, convincing herself that tonight he might join her, might sit beside her, might offer some fragment of the intimacy marriage was supposed to contain. He never did. By the second year, she'd stopped trying to engage him and started trying to understand him. She studied him like a language she'd never quite master, cataloging the tiny betrayals of expression that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. The way his jaw tightened when certain names were mentioned at court. The distant, damaged look that flickered through his eyes whenever Vienna came up in conversation. Vienna, where he'd served as military attaché 4 years before their marriage, where something had happened that nobody spoke about directly, but everyone referenced in careful, coded language. Where she lived. The woman whose name Evelyn had assembled from fragments of gossip and Alexander's own nightmares when he thought she was asleep. Isabel. Evelyn never asked about her. What would be the point? Alexander had made it abundantly clear that his interior life was none of her concern, that the arrangement between them entitled her to his name and his protection, and absolutely nothing else. Asking about Isabel would be like asking why the sun rose, an exercise in futility, a confession of powerlessness. So she focused on what she could control. She ran his household impeccably, managed his social calendar with precision, played the role of Duchess Whitmore so convincingly that even she sometimes forgot it was a performance. She became fluent in the language of aristocratic pretense, learned to smile through humiliation, to transform loneliness into grace. It was, in its own way, a kind of death. A slow suffocation of everything she'd been before the marriage. A girl who'd loved poetry and philosophy, who'd volunteered at hospitals in Manchester and dreamed of becoming a doctor before her father explained that Carter daughters became wives, not professionals. That girl disappeared inch by inch inside the Whitmore estate, replaced by a woman who perfected the art of stillness, who could sit through 14-course dinners without betraying emotion, who never cried where anyone could see. Alexander never noticed the transformation, never noticed her at all, really, except as a fixture of the landscape, present, functional, irrelevant, until the 3rd anniversary. He'd arranged the celebration without consulting her, which was typical. A grand ball at their London residence, 300 guests, an orchestra brought in from Paris, enough champagne to drown a regiment. The kind of ostentatious display that demonstrated wealth and taste and absolute indifference to the actual humans theoretically being honored. Evelyn had worn emerald silk that night, a dress that had taken 2 months to construct and cost more than most families earned in a year. Her maid had woven pearls through her hair and painted her face until she looked like someone else entirely. Someone beautiful and distant and untouchable. She descended the stairs at precisely 8 o'clock and found Alexander already in the ballroom, surrounded by admirers and sycophants, holding court like the aristocratic predator he was. He'd glanced up when she entered, registered her presence with the same mild attention he'd give a servant announcing dinner, then returned to his conversation. The evening had proceeded exactly as planned. Evelyn had danced with earls and viscounts and lesser nobility, smiled until her face ached, accepted congratulations on her marriage with the gracious detachment expected of someone in her position. She'd watched Alexander move through the crowd like a shark through water, confident, dangerous, completely in his element. She'd even convinced herself she was fine, that this was simply her life now, and she'd made peace with it. Then Isabel walked in. Evelyn saw her before Alexander did, saw the woman in the doorway wearing burgundy silk and 7 years of European sophistication like armor. Saw the way conversation rippled and died around her, the way people stepped back as if from something radioactive. Saw Alexander's face when he finally turned and recognized her. Every carefully constructed wall she'd built around her heart shattered in that moment. Because the expression that crossed Alexander's face when he looked at Isabel, raw, desperate, devastatingly alive, was an expression Evelyn had never seen directed at her in 3 years of marriage. This was what love looked like on him. This was what it meant to actually matter to Alexander Whitmore. And Evelyn could never inspire it. Isabel crossed the ballroom slowly, deliberately, every eye tracking her progress. She moved like someone accustomed to attention, to power, to getting exactly what she wanted. And what she wanted, apparently, was Alexander. Evelyn watched from across the room as they met. Watched Isabel say something that made Alexander's expression crack open. Watched him reach for her hand like a drowning man reaching for rope. Then watched him walk out of his own anniversary celebration with another woman, leaving Evelyn standing alone in a room full of witnesses. The silence that followed was worse than any confrontation could have been. 300 people suddenly very interested in their champagne, in the orchestra, in anything except the Duchess Whitmore, whose husband had just publicly destroyed her. Evelyn stood perfectly still for exactly 10 seconds. Then she smiled, that practiced aristocratic smile she'd perfected over 3 years, and turned to the nearest cluster of guests. Made it through another hour, laughed at jokes she didn't hear, accepted sympathetic looks with gracious dismissal, performed her role so flawlessly that several guests later remarked on her remarkable composure. Then she went upstairs, locked herself in her chambers, and systematically destroyed everything breakable in the room. The mirror went first, then the porcelain figures on the mantel, the crystal decanter Alexander had received as a wedding gift, the jewelry box containing the necklace he'd given her on their first anniversary, the only gift he'd ever personally selected, chosen by his secretary, delivered without comment. She destroyed it all with methodical precision, each shattered piece a small revenge against the life that had been chosen for her, against the man who'd never wanted her, against herself for believing anything could change. When she finally stopped, her hands were bleeding and the room looked like a crime scene, like evidence of violence, which she supposed it was, just a different kind than most people imagined. She cleaned the wounds herself, wrapped her hands carefully, changed into a simple traveling dress, and sat down to write the letter she should have written 3 years ago. It took 7 attempts to get it right, to capture the exact tone of dignified departure without pleading, without anger, without any of the messy emotion that might suggest he'd actually hurt her. Alexander, I'm signing the papers and leaving London. You'll find everything in order, the household accounts, the staff schedules, the social calendar through the end of the season. My solicitor will contact yours regarding the settlement. Thank you for your courtesy these past 3 years. I wish you well. Evelyn. She left it on his desk, along with the signed divorce documents his lawyers had prepared months ago and kept in a drawer like a loaded gun, waiting for one of them to finally pull the trigger. Then she walked out of the Whitmore estate at 4 in the morning with a single trunk and no destination. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd arrived as Lady Evelyn Carter, daughter of industrial wealth, educated at the finest schools, fluent in 4 languages, trained from birth to be the perfect aristocratic wife. She left as no one in particular, just a woman with bleeding hands and a trunk full of expensive dresses she'd never wear again, walking away from the only life she'd ever known. The city was different at that hour. London, without its daytime polish, stripped down to something rawer and more honest. Street cleaners and dock workers and women in thin shawls selling flowers that wouldn't last the day. People who worked with their hands and lived in the gaps between the version of England that people like Alexander governed and the version that actually existed. Evelyn had seen poverty before, of course, had done charity work the way aristocratic women were expected to, organized drives, attended benefits, written generous checks to causes that kept suffering at a comfortable distance. But she'd never actually been in it, never walked these streets without a carriage waiting, without servants, without the invisible armor of class and wealth that made her theoretically sympathetic to the poor while remaining fundamentally untouchable by their reality. She walked for hours, watching the city wake up, watching people hustle and survive and make do with whatever they had, watching a version of life that had nothing to do with balls and titles and 300 guest humiliations. By the time the sun came up, she'd made a decision. She found a boarding house in Whitechapel, traded her emerald silk dress and pearl necklace for 6 months' rent and enough money to live on if she was careful, cut her hair short with sewing scissors, and started calling herself Eve Cooper. Then she did the thing she'd wanted to do since she was 16 years old, before her father had explained that Carter women didn't have careers. She found a hospital that needed volunteers. St. Bartholomew's didn't ask questions about her background, didn't care that she'd never formally studied medicine, didn't give a damn about her lack of credentials. They needed hands, and she had them. Damaged, bandaged, but functional. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts cleaning wounds and changing bedding and holding down patients while doctors sawed through infected limbs. The smell alone, blood and carbolic acid and human desperation, would have made the Evelyn of a month ago physically ill. But this Evelyn, this Eve, found something in the brutality that felt like truth. These people were dying from preventable diseases, from industrial accidents, from the kind of grinding poverty that killed as efficiently as any war. And nobody with actual power, people like Alexander, like her father, like everyone she'd grown up knowing, gave a damn. They wrote checks. They attended charity galas. They performed concern the way Evelyn had performed her marriage, with grace and conviction and absolutely no real commitment. But they didn't actually show up, didn't touch the wounds or smell the rot or look dying people in the eyes and admit that the system that elevated some and crushed others was fundamentally broken. Eve showed up. She learned to clean wounds properly, to spot infection, to comfort people who were terrified and alone. She learned the names of the nurses who worked triple shifts because they couldn't afford not to. She learned which doctors were brilliant and which were incompetent and which were so exhausted they were practically killing people through sheer sleep deprivation. She learned that medicine wasn't the pristine science she'd imagined from her father's library. It was brutal and imperfect and constantly compromised by lack of resources, lack of time, lack of people who actually gave a damn. And she was good at it. Better than she'd been at being a duchess, certainly. Better than she'd been at pretending her marriage was something other than a beautiful prison. 6 months in, one of the senior physicians, a gruff Scottish man named Dr. McAllister, who treated everyone equally terribly, pulled her aside after she'd successfully talked down a patient who'd been screaming about demons in the walls. "What's your story, Cooper? You're too educated for this kind of work. Too soft-handed, even now. Running from something or running toward it?" "Both," she'd said, which was more honesty than she'd offered anyone in years. McAllister had studied her for a long moment. Then he'd nodded once, sharp and definitive. "You've got the hands for this. The stomach, too. You want to actually learn medicine, I'll teach you. But you work for it. No special treatment, no shortcuts. You fail, you're out." She didn't fail. She worked harder than she'd ever worked at anything, studied medical texts by candlelight in her boarding house room, practiced suturing on dead rats until her fingers bled again, memorized anatomy and pharmacology, and the 1,000 small skills that separated competent doctors from the ones who killed people through ignorance. McAllister was a brutal teacher, demanding, unforgiving, incapable of praise. But he was brilliant, and he actually taught her instead of just letting her watch. Treated her like a student instead of a charity case or a curiosity. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Carter, Eve Cooper, became someone real, someone useful, someone defined by what she could do rather than who she'd married or what family she'd been born into. She almost forgot about Alexander entirely. Almost. But then, 2 years after she'd walked out of his life, London started burning. The riots began in the industrial districts. Factory workers and dock laborers pushed past breaking point by wages that wouldn't cover rent, by working conditions that crippled and killed, by a government that protected factory owners and ignored everyone else. It started with strikes, then sabotage, then violence. The government's response was predictable and brutal. Send in troops, arrest the ringleaders, use force to restore order while ignoring every underlying cause. And who did they send to command the military response? Who did the crown trust to handle the crisis with appropriate ruthlessness? Duke Alexander Whitmore. War hero, brilliant strategist, a man famous for winning battles through superior force and absolute unwillingness to compromise. Eve heard the news while stitching up a factory worker who'd been beaten by private security forces for trying to organize a union. The man was reading a newspaper someone had left behind, and there it was, a sketch of Alexander in full military regalia, accompanying an article about the crown's decisive response to civil unrest. Her hands had trembled for exactly 3 seconds. Then she'd finished the sutures and moved to the next patient. Alexander was someone else's problem now. She'd built a life without him, built a version of herself that didn't disintegrate in his absence. Whatever he did to quell the riots, however many people he hurt in service of maintaining order, it had nothing to do with her. Except it did. Because the riots got worse, the violence escalated, and the casualties started pouring into St. Bartholomew's faster than they could handle. McAllister converted the hospital's basement into a makeshift trauma ward. Eve worked 20-hour shifts trying to save people who'd been shot by soldiers, trampled in crowds, beaten so badly their own families couldn't recognize them. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating regularly, stopped thinking about anything except the next patient, the next wound, the next person who might die if she wasn't fast enough or smart enough or skilled enough. Then, 3 weeks into the crisis, they brought in the Duke. Eve was in the basement when the commotion started upstairs, shouting, running footsteps, "Doctor." McAllister's voice cutting through the chaos with that particular edge that meant someone important was dying. She'd assumed it was a government official, someone whose death would be politically complicated, requiring the best care the hospital could provide. She'd grabbed her medical kit and run upstairs without asking questions, found a crowd of nurses and junior doctors clustered around the main examination table, found McAllister barking orders while 2 men held down a patient who was thrashing weakly, delirious with pain. Found Alexander Whitmore bleeding out in front of her. The steel pipe had gone through his left shoulder, missing the major arteries by perhaps an inch. Shrapnel had torn through his side. Burns covered his right arm where he'd apparently tried to shield someone from an explosion. He'd been protecting civilians, someone was saying. Threw himself in front of the blast. Saved at least a dozen people. Eve stood frozen for approximately 10 seconds, watching the man who'd destroyed her life now fighting for his own, watching him vulnerable and damaged and stripped of every advantage he'd ever possessed. Every instinct she'd developed over 3 years of medical training said, move, help him, do your job. Every instinct from her previous life said, walk away. Let someone else save him. Let him experience what it felt like to need someone who didn't give a damn whether he lived or died. McAllister looked up and saw her. Cooper, I need your hands. Now. Eve stepped forward. Not because she'd forgiven him. Not because she still loved him. Not because of anything except the fundamental promise she'd made when she started this work. That every person deserved care, deserved fighting for, deserved someone to stand between them and death. Even the ones who'd never extended her the same courtesy. She worked on Alexander for 6 hours straight, cleaned the wounds, extracted shrapnel, sutured tissue that had been shredded by metal and fire. Her hands stayed steady even when she looked at his face and recognized the features she'd once memorized in the dark, hoping proximity might breed affection. He never regained consciousness during the surgery. Never recognized her. Never knew that the hand saving his life belonged to the woman he'd erased. When it was over, when they'd done everything they could and Alexander's survival became a question of time and luck rather than skill, McAllister pulled her aside. You know him. It wasn't a question. Yes. He going to be a problem for you? Eve looked back at the table where Alexander lay unconscious, his face pale and slack, looking younger and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "No," she said. "He's just another patient." Which was the truth, or as close to it as she could manage. They moved Alexander to a private room, not because he deserved special treatment, but because having a Duke recovering in the main ward would have created chaos. Eve assigned herself to his case personally, which McAllister questioned exactly once before her expression made clear the matter wasn't up for discussion. For 3 days, Alexander drifted in and out of consciousness while infection threatened to finish what the explosion hadn't. Eve sat with him through the worst of it, monitoring his fever, changing his dressings, forcing water and medicine down his throat when he was coherent enough to swallow. He never recognized her. The combination of fever and delirium and the sheer improbability of his discarded wife working as a doctor in a charity hospital kept him from seeing what was directly in front of him. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Eve was checking his wounds when his eyes opened, actually focused for the first time since the surgery. He looked at her for a long moment, confused but conscious. "Where?" His voice came out ruined, barely more than a whisper. "St. Bartholomew's Hospital. You were injured in the riots. You're going to survive." He processed this information slowly. Then his eyes tracked to the window, to the view of Whitechapel outside. "This isn't—" His face shifted through confusion toward understanding. "This isn't a military hospital. No, you were brought here because it was closest, because you were dying and nobody cared about protocol." Something flickered across his expression. Pride, maybe. Discomfort at finding himself in a charity hospital surrounded by the people his troops had been beating back for weeks. "I need to return to—" "You need to stay in that bed for at least another week, unless you want to die of infection." Eve's voice was flat, professional, offering no room for argument. "Your wounds are severe. You've lost a significant amount of blood. You move before you're healed, you'll tear open everything we've repaired." Alexander stared at her, actually looked at her face for the first time. And Eve saw the moment recognition started to dawn, the confusion, the disbelief, the slow horror of understanding. Evelyn? Her name in his mouth after 2 years felt like violence. "That's not my name anymore," she said calmly. "And you need to rest." She walked out before he could respond. Before he could ask questions she had no intention of answering. Before the careful control she'd maintained for 4 days started to crack. Outside the room, she leaned against the wall and let herself shake for exactly 60 seconds. Then she returned to work. But everything had changed. Because Alexander was awake now. Alexander recognized her. And Alexander, she was about to discover, didn't know how to process a world where his discarded wife had more power than he did. Where she could walk away and he couldn't follow. Wicked. The next 3 weeks were brutal in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. Alexander healed slowly, reluctantly, visibly furious at his own weakness. Eve treated him with the same professional detachment she offered every patient, efficient, competent, completely impersonal, which drove him insane. He tried to talk to her, tried to ask questions about where she'd been, what she'd been doing, how the hell she'd become a doctor. Eve deflected every attempt, kept their interactions focused purely on his medical care, refused to engage with anything personal. The man who'd ignored her for 3 years suddenly couldn't handle being ignored for 3 minutes. "You can't just—" He'd tried on the 5th day of consciousness, frustration bleeding through his carefully maintained aristocratic control. "You can't pretend I don't exist. I'm not pretending anything. I'm treating your injuries. That's my job." "Evelyn." "Eve." "What?" "My name is Eve Cooper. Evelyn doesn't exist anymore. You made sure of that." She'd watched him absorb the hit, watched him try to formulate a response that wouldn't sound like the hollow apology it would inevitably become. Then she'd left before he could find the words. But she couldn't avoid him entirely. He was her patient. She had to check his wounds, monitor his recovery, ensure he didn't do something stupid and rip open the sutures. And somewhere in those necessary interactions, she started to see things she'd never noticed during their marriage. The nightmares, for one thing. Alexander woke screaming most nights, thrashing against sheets soaked with sweat, his voice raw with terror as he fought battles that only existed in his head. Eve would have to physically restrain him sometimes to keep him from tearing his wounds open. The guilt for another. She'd catch him staring out the window at Whitechapel, his expression carved with something that looked almost like shame, like he was finally seeing the poverty and suffering his policies had created, seeing it up close instead of as statistics in a military report. And the loneliness. God, the bone-deep loneliness that bled through every interaction, every attempt to connect with her. Every moment he realized that the power and status he'd always relied on meant absolutely nothing in this place. "He's different with you," one of the younger nurses mentioned one evening. "Duke or not, he treats most of us like servants. But he watches like he's trying to solve a puzzle." "He's not a puzzle," Eve said quietly. "He's just a man who's never had to face consequences before." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was still true. Because something was shifting in Alexander. Something beyond the physical healing. She'd catch him talking to other patients sometimes. Actually talking. Asking about their lives. Listening to their stories with what looked like genuine attention. She'd seen him give his expensive watch to a factory worker's widow who couldn't afford her husband's burial. She'd watched him dress down a visiting government official who suggested the hospital should prioritize treating soldiers over rioters, his voice cold with a fury that seemed almost personal. These were not the actions of the man who'd walked out of his anniversary celebration with another woman. Not the man who'd treated his wife like furniture for 3 years, which meant either Alexander was performing an elaborate manipulation or something fundamental had actually changed. Eve didn't know which possibility terrified her more. On the 20th day of his recovery, Alexander finally asked the question she'd been waiting for. "What happened to you after you left?" They were alone in his room. Evening light coming through the window, casting shadows across his face that made him look almost human. Eve had been changing his dressing, her hands steady as they worked, her expression carefully neutral. "I became someone else." "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting." She finished the dressing in silence, started to pack up her supplies. Alexander's hand caught her wrist, gentle but firm. The first time he touched her with intention since she'd arrived. Eve froze. "I need to understand," he said quietly. "I need to know what I did to you." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, at the scars on her own hands from 2 years of medical work, at the gulf between the people they'd been and the people they'd become. "You didn't do anything to me, Alexander. You just didn't do anything for me. There's a difference. Evelyn, I waited for you. Every night for 3 years, I waited for you to notice I existed, to care that I existed. And you never did." She pulled her wrist free, her voice still calm, still controlled. "You proved that love was something you were capable of feeling, just not for me. So I stopped waiting, stopped being the person who needed your attention, stopped existing in relation to you at all. I was cruel. No. You were absent. Cruelty requires intention. You just genuinely didn't care enough to be cruel." She watched him absorb that, watched the defense mechanisms fail one by one until he was just sitting there, looking destroyed in a way that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. "I'm sorry. 2 years ago, those words would have meant something, would have been the thing she desperately needed to hear. But now they were just sounds. Just another too-late gesture from a man who'd never learned to value something until he'd already destroyed it. "I know you are," Eve said. "But sorry doesn't fix 3 years of loneliness. Sorry doesn't give me back the person I was before you married me. Sorry is just a word people say when they finally face consequences." "Then what do I do?" "You heal. You leave. You live whatever life you want." Eve met his eyes directly, her expression empty of everything except professional courtesy. "Just do it somewhere far away from me." She walked out before he could respond, but his question followed her. "What do I do?" As if she owed him an answer. As if her job was to absolve him, to provide a path toward redemption, to make his guilt easier to carry. Eve had spent 3 years managing Alexander's comfort. She was done. The next morning, she informed McAllister that she was transferring Alexander's care to another doctor. McAllister had looked at her for a long moment. "You sure about this?" "Yes." "He's going to make a fuss." "Let him." And he did. Alexander demanded to see her, refused treatment from other doctors, generally made himself as difficult as possible in what Eve recognized as a desperate attempt to maintain connection. She ignored all of it, focused on other patients. Let Alexander throw whatever aristocratic tantrum he needed to throw. On the 23rd day, he tried a different approach. Eve was in the main ward when one of the nurses found her. Said there was an emergency in Alexander's room. Her stomach had dropped. Infection, hemorrhage, some complication she'd missed. She ran, found Alexander sitting up in bed, fully conscious, looking healthier than he had in weeks. No emergency. Just a man who'd learned to manipulate the one thing guaranteed to bring her running. The fury that rose in Eve's chest was incandescent. "You think this is a game?" She kept her voice low, controlled, but every word carried the weight of 3 years' worth of rage. "You think you can fake a medical emergency because you want attention? I needed to talk to you. So you lied. So you pulled me away from actual patients who actually need help because what? Because you finally decided I'm worth your time? Evelyn, get out." "What?" "You're healed enough to travel. Your wounds are closed. You don't need to be here anymore." Eve walked to the door, held it open. "So get out of my hospital. Get out of my city. Get back to whatever life you had before you decided showing up here was noble." Alexander stared at her. "I was trying to protect those people, and that's admirable. Truly. But it doesn't erase 3 years of you treating me like I didn't exist. It doesn't mean I owe you forgiveness or attention or another second of my time. I know I hurt you." "You didn't hurt me." Eve's voice finally cracked, the control she'd maintained for weeks fracturing just enough to let truth through. "You killed me. You married me and you killed every version of myself I might have become, and you did it with indifference. Not hate, not cruelty, just complete and total indifference. So no, Alexander, you don't get to fake emergencies and demand my time. You don't get anything from me except the medical care I'd give any patient." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Alexander stood, slowly, carefully, moving like a man who'd been broken and poorly repaired. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't deserve anything from you." He gathered his few belongings, moved toward the door where Eve still stood, stopped beside her. "For what it's worth," he said, meeting her eyes directly for the first time in 3 years with something that looked almost like honesty, "the woman I see now is worth 1,000 of the man I was then." Then he walked out. And Eve stood in the empty room, shaking with emotion she couldn't name, wondering why his leaving felt worse than it had the first time, wondering why she'd wanted him to stay. Eve stood in that empty room for 7 minutes. She counted them on the clock mounted above the bed where Alexander had slept for 23 days, where she'd pulled him back from death with her own damaged hands, where he'd just walked out after saying something that felt like a blade between her ribs. "The woman I see now is worth 1,000 of the man I was then." Hollow words. Pretty sentiment wrapped around nothing. The kind of thing men said when they'd finally figured out what they'd lost and wanted credit for noticing. She forced herself to move. Back to the main ward, where actual patients needed actual help, instead of whatever emotional reckoning Alexander thought he deserved. But her hands were shaking when she reached for the first chart, and McAllister noticed. "Take the rest of the day, Cooper. I'm fine." "You're rattled. I can see it from here." McAllister's expression was unreadable behind his perpetual scowl. "Whatever happened with the Duke, deal with it somewhere that's not my hospital. He's gone. It's handled." "Is it?" Eve met his eyes, saw the question underneath the question, the thing McAllister had been too professional to ask directly for 3 weeks, but was asking now. "Yes, it's handled." She worked the rest of her shift anyway because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant processing emotions she had no intention of processing. Easier to focus on the factory worker with the crushed hand, the child with pneumonia, the woman who'd miscarried in an alley and nearly bled out before someone brought her in. Easier to be useful than human. But when her shift finally ended and she walked back to her boarding house through Whitechapel's narrow streets, the exhaustion hit like a physical weight. Not just from the day. From 2 years of running from a life that had nearly destroyed her. From 23 days of treating the man who'd been the architect of that destruction. From the creeping, unwanted awareness that something fundamental had shifted and she didn't know how to shift it back. Her room was exactly as she'd left it. Narrow bed, small desk, medical texts stacked in careful piles because space was a luxury she couldn't afford. The window looked out on brick walls and laundry lines and the kind of poverty that never made it into Alexander's military reports. This was her life now. Small and purposeful and entirely her own. So why did it suddenly feel insufficient? She stripped off her blood-stained dress, washed in cold water from the basin, and climbed into bed still damp because waiting for her hair to dry meant more time thinking. Sleep didn't come. Just Alexander's voice on repeat. "You killed me. You married me, and you killed every version of myself I might have become." Had she actually said that? Had those words actually left her mouth after 3 years of perfect aristocratic restraint? Yes, and she'd meant them. but saying them out loud had cracked something open that she'd been keeping carefully sealed. Some part of her that still cared what Alexander thought, still wanted him to understand the damage he'd caused, still needed him to see her, which was pathetic, which was the opposite of everything she'd worked to become. She didn't sleep that night, just lay in the dark listening to Whitechapel's sounds, drunks fighting, children crying, the perpetual grind of a city that never stopped needing and wanting and suffering. At some point near dawn, she made a decision. She was leaving London, leaving St. Bartholomew's, leaving the possibility of running into Alexander again because clearly 23 days of proximity had done something corrosive to her carefully constructed defenses. McAllister would understand. Or he wouldn't. Either way, she was done. She got dressed, walked to the hospital, found McAllister in his office before morning rounds. I need to transfer. Somewhere outside London. Anywhere you have connections. McAllister looked up from the paperwork he'd been reviewing. Took in her expression with that clinical assessment he applied to everything. This about the Duke? This is about me needing a change. He studied her for a long moment. Then he pulled out a sheet of paper, wrote something in his cramped handwriting, and slid it across the desk. Manchester, Industrial District. They're setting up a clinic for factory workers and their families. Brutal conditions, minimal resources, no glory. You'd be one of 2 doctors for about 5,000 people. When can I start? Yesterday, ideally. They're desperate. Perfect. McAllister's expression shifted into something that might have been approval if he'd been capable of such sentiment. You've been good here, Cooper. Better than good. You sure you want to start over? I've started over before. And how'd that work out? Eve met his eyes. I'm still breathing. That's more than a lot of people can say. Fair enough. McAllister stood, offered his hand. You need a reference. You tell them to contact me directly. Anyone gives you trouble about credentials, you have them write to me. I'll make it clear you're qualified. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Manchester's going to make this place look like a resort. She shook his hand, left his office, started packing her few belongings that same afternoon. She was gone from London within 48 hours. Manchester was everything McAllister had promised, and worse. The clinic occupied a converted warehouse in the shadow of textile mills that ran 20 hours a day, filling the air with coal smoke and the mechanical scream of looms. The workers who came through the door had lungs destroyed by cotton dust, hands mangled by machinery, bodies worn down by labor that paid barely enough to survive. The other doctor was a young man named Thomas Brennan, fresh from medical school and idealistic in the way only people who'd never actually worked in poverty could be. He talked about systemic change and worker protections and unionization like these were solutions rather than fantasies. Eve didn't argue with him, just focused on the work. They saw 60 patients a day minimum. Infections, injuries, malnutrition, diseases that should have been preventable but weren't, because prevention required resources nobody had. Eve worked until her hands went numb, until she stopped tasting food, until sleep became something that happened in 3-hour increments between crises. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of obliterating exhaustion that left no room for memory or regret or Alexander's voice saying things that shouldn't matter. For 3 months, it worked. Then the letters started arriving. The first came to the clinic, forwarded through McAllister because apparently Alexander had contacts everywhere. Eve almost burned it without opening. But something, curiosity, stupidity, some weakness she hadn't successfully killed, made her break the seal. It was short, no apologies, no pleading, just 3 sentences in handwriting she recognized from years of seeing it on official documents. I've resigned my military commission. I'm staying in London. I need to understand what you've been doing here. She burned it anyway. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later, longer this time. Details about how he'd been visiting the neighborhoods where the riots had happened, talking to families who'd lost people, seeing the poverty and desperation that had driven the violence. Burned. The third letter was different. It included a bank draft for an amount that would fund the Manchester clinic for 6 months. No conditions attached, just resources and a single line. Use this however you see fit. Eve stared at that draft for 20 minutes, hating that it was useful, hating that she needed it, hating that Alexander had found the one thing she couldn't simply dismiss. She cashed it, used every penny on medical supplies and equipment the clinic desperately needed, didn't write back. The fourth letter arrived with another draft, this one even larger, and a longer explanation. Alexander had apparently been liquidating assets, selling properties, redirecting his wealth toward rebuilding the neighborhoods his troops had damaged during the riots. It sounded like performance, like guilt turned into spectacle. But the money was real, and the clinic needed it. Eve started accepting the drafts without reading the accompanying letters. Let them pile up unopened on her small desk. Told herself this was just practical resource allocation, nothing more. Thomas noticed. "You've got a benefactor?" "Apparently. Anyone I should know about?" "No." Thomas was smart enough not to push, but he watched her with increasing curiosity as the donations kept coming, as the clinic expanded, as they were able to hire another nurse and stock medicines they'd never been able to afford before. The fifth letter came with something different. No money. Just a newspaper clipping about a hospital Alexander was funding in East London, specifically designed to treat industrial workers and their families. Free care. No questions asked. And at the bottom, in his handwriting, "I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to do better. I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know I'm trying." Eve read that one 3 times before burning it. Because trying wasn't the same as succeeding. Trying was just another word for not good enough. And she'd spent 3 years being not good enough for him. She wasn't about to reward him for finally experiencing the same inadequacy. But something was shifting despite her resistance. Some crack in the armor she'd built. She started reading the newspapers that made their way to Manchester. Started noticing articles about the Duke of Whitmore's radical transformation, his rejection of aristocratic privilege, his work in London's poorest districts. Started wondering if it was real or just another performance. 6 months after leaving London, Eve got a different kind of letter. This one from Dr. McAllister, written in his usual blunt style. "Your Duke's been showing up at St. Bartholomew's twice a week. Works alongside the nurses. Cleans bedpans. Holds down patients during amputations. Doesn't talk about it. Doesn't ask for credit. Just shows up and does the work. Thought you should know." Something cold settled in Eve's chest. Because this wasn't performance. This was Alexander actually changing. Actually becoming someone different than the man who'd walked out of his anniversary celebration. And she didn't know what to do with that information. Thomas found her in the clinic's storage room that evening, supposedly doing inventory, but actually just standing there staring at McAllister's letter. "You all right?" "Fine. You're a terrible liar, Cooper." Thomas leaned against the doorframe, his expression genuinely concerned. "Whatever's eating you, it's getting worse. You're working yourself to death." "I'm working the same as always." "No. You're running." "I've seen it before. People who work like you're working, they're not building something. They're hiding from something." Eve looked at him. At this earnest young doctor who thought problems could be solved through dedication and good intentions. At someone who'd never had their life destroyed by indifference and was therefore still capable of hope. "You should get back to patients," she said. "Talk to me first." "There's nothing to talk about." "Bullshit!" Thomas moved into the room, closed the door behind him. "You're brilliant, and you're compassionate, and you're killing yourself. And I think it's because you're afraid that if you stop moving, something's going to catch up with you." "Very insightful, Dr. Brennan. I'm right, though." Eve was silent for a long moment. Then, surprising herself, she told him. Not everything, just the outline. A marriage that wasn't. 3 years of invisibility. Walking away and rebuilding herself. The man who'd destroyed her now apparently trying to rebuild himself. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for several seconds. "So what are you afraid of? That he's changed or that he hasn't?" The question hit harder than it should have. "I don't know. You want my opinion?" "Not particularly. You're going to get it anyway." Thomas's expression was gentle but firm. "You built something incredible out of the wreckage he left. You became someone powerful and independent. And now he's showing up trying to become someone worthy of you. And that terrifies you because if he actually succeeds, you might have to forgive him." "I don't have to forgive anyone." "No, but you might want to, and that's scarier than hate." Eve felt something break open in her chest. Some truth she'd been avoiding for 6 months. What if I forgive him, and he goes back to being who he was? Then you'll survive it. You've survived worse. But what if you don't forgive him and he actually changed? What if you miss the possibility of something real because you're too busy protecting yourself from what already happened? She wanted to argue, wanted to dismiss this as naive optimism from someone who'd never been broken by another person's indifference. But she couldn't, because Thomas was right. She was terrified. Not of Alexander being unchanged, of him being genuinely different and her having to acknowledge that people could actually transform. That night, Eve did something she hadn't done in 6 months. She opened all the letters Alexander had sent, read them in chronological order, watched his handwriting shift from formal to desperate to quietly determined, watched him document his transformation, not for her approval, but because he genuinely seemed to think she deserved to know. The most recent letter was 2 weeks old, shorter than the others. I don't expect you to respond. I don't expect anything. But I need to tell you what I've learned. Privilege isn't just wealth or title. It's the ability to avoid consequences, to hurt people without seeing the damage. I lived my entire life insulated from reality, and you paid the price for that. I can't undo it, but I can refuse to be that person anymore. I can show up. I can see people. I can do the work. Not because it earns forgiveness, because it's right. You taught me that. You probably don't remember, but during our marriage, you volunteered at hospitals. I thought it was a hobby, a way to fill time. I didn't understand you were trying to become someone real in a life that made you ornamental. I understand now. I see it every day in the people I work with. People who matter because of what they do, not what they're called. I'm trying to be one of those people. I thought you should know. Eve read it 3 times. Then she did something reckless. She wrote back. Her letter was brief, almost curt. If you're serious about this work, there's a clinic in Manchester that needs funding and volunteers. Show up or don't. Your choice. She included the address, sent it before she could reconsider, then waited. 2 weeks passed. Eve convinced herself he wouldn't come, that his transformation was real but geographically limited to London, where people could witness it, that asking him to come to Manchester had been a test he'd inevitably fail. Then he showed up. Eve was treating a factory worker with a crushed foot when Thomas appeared in the doorway. Cooper, you've got a visitor. Tell them to wait. I think you'll want to see this one. Something in his tone made her look up, made her follow him to the clinic's entrance where Alexander stood in clothes she'd never seen him wear. Simple cotton shirt, work trousers, boots that had actually seen labor. He looked different, thinner, harder, like someone who'd been broken down and imperfectly rebuilt. He looked real. Eve felt her carefully constructed defenses crack. You came. You invited me. Alexander's voice was careful, offering no presumption. If you want me to leave, I will. But if you need help, I'm here. We need help. Then put me to work. And just like that, Alexander Whitmore became part of the Manchester clinic. He didn't ask for special treatment, didn't mention his title or his background, just showed up every morning at dawn and worked until they physically sent him away at night. He cleaned wounds and changed bedding and held down screaming patients during procedures. He learned names and stories and the 1,000 ways poverty killed people slowly. He made mistakes and got corrected and learned without defending himself. Thomas was impressed despite his initial skepticism. Your benefactor's actually committed. He's not my anything. Right. That's why you watch him constantly when you think nobody's noticing. Eve wanted to deny it, couldn't, because she was watching. Looking for cracks in the performance, waiting for the moment Alexander's dedication would falter and prove this was just elaborate guilt management. But the moment didn't come. Alexander worked for 3 weeks without complaint, without seeking credit, without once trying to have a personal conversation with Eve beyond what the work required, which somehow made it worse, because she'd prepared for manipulation, for charm offensives and grand gestures and all the tools men like Alexander traditionally used to get what they wanted. She hadn't prepared for quiet consistency, for him simply showing up and being useful and asking for nothing in return. On the 22nd day, they had their first real conversation since he'd arrived. It was late. Most of the patients had gone home. Thomas had left hours ago. Eve was finishing paperwork while Alexander cleaned the examination rooms. He appeared in her office doorway, looking exhausted. I'm done. Unless you need anything else. We're good. He nodded. Started to leave, stopped. Can I ask you something? Eve looked up from her charts, measured the risk, finally nodded. Why did you invite me here? Honestly? Please. I wanted to see if you would actually come. If this transformation was real or just something you could sustain in London where it looked good. And? Eve studied him. This man who'd once seemed untouchable now standing in a converted warehouse in Manchester, covered in other people's blood and sweat, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. You came. You stayed. You worked. That's not an answer to whether I'm real. No. But it's evidence. Alexander absorbed this. Then he did something she didn't expect. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, not presuming intimacy, but not maintaining the careful distance he'd been keeping either. I owe you a real apology. Not the hollow thing I said at St. Bartholomew's. Something true. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. He met her eyes directly. I destroyed 3 years of your life because I was a coward. I married you knowing I didn't love you, knowing I was still holding on to someone else, knowing you deserved better. And instead of being honest, I just erased you, made you invisible in your own life. That wasn't indifference, Evelyn. That was cruelty. And I'm sorry. The use of her real name felt like touch. I told you, I'm Eve now. I know. But I'm apologizing to Evelyn, the woman I hurt. The woman who deserved a real marriage and got a prison instead. Eve felt something shift in her chest, some weight she'd been carrying without realizing it. What happened to Isabel? Alexander flinched. I went back to her after you left. Thought I'd finally gotten what I wanted. Turns out she wanted the title more than the man. When I resigned my commission and started liquidating assets, she left. Found a colonel with better prospects. Eve felt no satisfaction at this. Just a distant sadness for everyone involved. I'm sorry. Don't be. I deserved it. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion bleeding through. I spent my entire life believing love was something that happened to you, something you fell into. I didn't understand it was something you built, something you chose, every day, over and over. And now? Now I'm trying to build a life that matters, trying to be someone who shows up, who sees people. He paused, trying to become someone you might eventually not hate. I don't hate you, Alexander. Then what do you feel? The question hung between them like something fragile. Eve considered lying, considered the safe answer that would maintain distance and protect her from risk. Instead, she told the truth. I feel like I'm looking at someone I don't know, someone who looks like the man I married but moves through the world completely differently. And I don't know if that person is real or if he's just trauma and guilt shaped into something that looks like growth. That's fair, is it? Because from where I'm sitting, you've transformed in 6 months. And transformation that fast doesn't feel sustainable. It feels like crisis response. Like you're going to wake up one day and realize this isn't who you are, it's who you're performing. Maybe. Alexander's voice was quiet but steady. Or maybe crisis is what it takes for some people to wake up. Maybe I needed to almost die to realize I'd been dead the whole time. Pretty words, not words. Truth. He leaned forward slightly. You want to know what happened when I was lying in that hospital bed? When I looked up and saw you treating my wounds? Not particularly. I felt relief. Not because you were there, because I'd finally found you. Because you'd disappeared and I'd told myself it didn't matter. You were just another aristocratic wife who'd gotten bored and run off somewhere. He paused. But seeing you working, seeing what you'd built, realizing you'd become someone important while I stayed hollow, that destroyed every lie I'd been telling myself. About what? About who mattered. About what I'd lost. About whether I was capable of being more than the sum of my privileges. And are you? I don't know yet, but I'm trying to find out. They sat in silence for several moments, the clinic quiet except for Manchester's perpetual industrial background noise. Finally, Eve spoke. You can't stay here forever. This isn't your life. It's mine. I know. So what's your plan? Work here until you feel absolved? Until you've done enough penance? No. Alexander's voice was firm. I'm working here because the work matters. Because these people need help and I can provide it. If you want me to leave, I will. But not because I've checked some box in my redemption plan. Because you've decided my presence does more harm than good. Eve studied him, looking for deception, for manipulation. Saw only exhaustion and determination. Stay, she said. But if this is performance, if you're going to burn out and leave these people halfway through, I need you to go now. We can't afford to lose a doctor. I'm not leaving. People say that all the time. Then life gets hard, and they remember they have other options. I don't want other options. Alexander's voice was quiet, but absolute. I want this to be my life. I want to be someone who shows up, who does work that matters. I want to be someone you don't have to protect people from. Why? because the alternative is going back to being the man I was, and I'd rather die. The rawness in his voice cracked something in Eve's carefully maintained defenses. All right, she said, stay. She meant for a while, for as long as it lasted. But somewhere in the next 6 weeks, stay became something else. Alexander didn't just work at the clinic. He transformed it, used his connections to secure equipment they desperately needed, convinced other aristocrats to fund expansion, brought in specialists from London to train the staff. But more than that, he changed how they operated, started tracking outcomes, identifying patterns and injuries that pointed to unsafe factory conditions, building cases against owners who were killing workers through negligence. He turned medicine into advocacy, into systemic change, and Eve watched him do it with a combination of admiration and terror, because this version of Alexander was genuinely impressive, was someone she could respect, could potentially care about, which meant she was vulnerable again. Thomas noticed the shift. You're softening toward him. I'm acknowledging he's useful. Bullshit. You look at him differently now, like he's a person instead of a problem. He is a person. So are you going to forgive him? Eve didn't have an answer, but she knew something had changed the night Manchester caught fire. The blaze started in a textile mill around midnight. By the time anyone noticed, it had spread to 3 adjacent buildings, including a boarding house where 70 workers and their families lived. The clinic was flooded with casualties within an hour. Burns, smoke inhalation, people who jumped from third-story windows and shattered their legs. Eve, Thomas, and Alexander worked for 18 hours straight, triaging in the street because the clinic couldn't hold everyone, making impossible decisions about who got treatment first, watching people die because there weren't enough hands. At hour 16, a woman came running up screaming about children still trapped in the building's basement. The fire brigade had declared it too unstable to enter, too dangerous. Alexander looked at Eve. Then he ran toward the burning building. Eve's heart stopped. She watched him disappear into smoke and flame, watched the structure groan and shift, watched Thomas physically restrain her when she tried to follow. 4 minutes later, Alexander emerged carrying 2 children, went back in immediately, came out with 3 more, went back in. The building partially collapsed as he was inside the 4th time. Eve heard herself screaming his name, heard the sound of her own voice breaking. Then he appeared in a different doorway, covered in burns, carrying a child who wasn't breathing. Eve grabbed the child, started resuscitation while Thomas caught Alexander before he collapsed. The child survived. So did Alexander, barely. They treated his burns in the clinic because the hospital was already overwhelmed. Eve worked on him with shaking hands while he drifted in and out of consciousness, his skin blackened and blistering. "You're an idiot," she said, her voice raw. "You could have died. Worth it." His words were slurred with pain. "Those kids. I know, you would have done the same." "Yes, but I'm not." She stopped. Couldn't finish. "Not what?" "Not supposed to matter to me." Alexander's eyes opened, focused on her face despite the agony he must have been experiencing. "Do I? Matter to you?" Eve looked at him. At this man who destroyed her and rebuilt himself and just ran into a burning building 4 times to save children he didn't know. At this man she'd spent 6 months trying not to care about and failed completely. "Yes," she whispered. "You matter." Then his hand found hers, squeezed once, and Eve squeezed back. The moment felt irrevocable, like stepping off a cliff, because she'd just admitted something she couldn't take back, something that made her vulnerable in ways she'd sworn she'd never be again. But as she sat there holding Alexander's burned hand while Manchester smoldered outside, Eve realized something. She didn't want to take it back, didn't want to keep running, keep hiding, keep protecting herself from the possibility that people could actually change. Alexander had transformed, not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely, and she wanted to see where that transformation led, even if it destroyed her again. Alexander's burns took 6 weeks to heal properly, and during that time something shifted in the clinic's ecosystem. Eve found herself sitting beside his bed during breaks she didn't actually have, talking about things that had nothing to do with medicine, about the books they'd both read, about Manchester's particular brand of industrial brutality, about whether transformation was something you chose or something that happened to you when everything else was stripped away. He told her about Vienna, about Isabel, and the fantasy he'd built around a woman who'd never actually existed outside his imagination. About returning to England convinced he'd lost something irreplaceable when really he'd just been in love with his own romantic mythology. She told him about the first patient she'd lost at St. Bartholomew's, a 10-year-old girl with pneumonia whose mother couldn't afford proper treatment. About holding that small body while it went cold and realizing that every aristocratic charity gala she'd ever attended was just performance designed to make wealthy people feel better about a system that was actively killing children. They were careful with each other, testing boundaries, learning whether this fragile thing building between them could sustain actual weight. Thomas watched it happen with the satisfied expression of someone who'd called it months ago. You two going to actually acknowledge what's happening, or just keep dancing around it? There's nothing happening, Eve said. Right. That's why you haven't left his side in 4 days. He's recovering from severe burns. I'm his doctor. You're a terrible liar, Cooper. Always have been. Eve didn't argue because Thomas was right. Something was happening, something that terrified her and pulled at her in equal measure. By the time Alexander could walk without assistance, the dynamic had shifted entirely. He was no longer just a volunteer or a benefactor or a man performing penance. He was integrated into the clinic's daily operations, into Manchester's community, into Eve's life in ways that felt both inevitable and impossible. And then the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a royal courier wearing full regalia, which immediately drew attention because nobody in this part of Manchester had ever seen someone in royal livery who wasn't there to arrest someone. The letter was addressed to Duke Alexander Whitmore, and the seal was from the crown itself. Alexander opened it in the clinic's office with Eve and Thomas present, read it twice, then set it down carefully like it might explode. What is it? Thomas asked. A summons. The king wants to see me. Eve felt cold settle in her stomach. About what? Alexander's expression was carefully neutral. About my resignation. About the work I've been doing. About whether I'm fit to maintain my title given my recent choices. They're threatening to strip your title? Not threatening. Considering. There's a difference. Thomas looked genuinely concerned. Can they do that? Technically, yes. If they determine I've brought disgrace to the position or failed to uphold the responsibilities associated with it. Have you? Alexander met Eve's eyes. According to them? Probably. I've liquidated most of the family assets, resigned my military commission, publicly criticized policies the crown supports, spent the last 6 months working in poverty rather than attending court. Sounds like you've been busy being a decent human, Thomas said. Sounds like I've been busy dismantling everything my family spent 200 years building. Alexander's voice was flat. They want me to explain myself, to justify my choices, to prove I haven't lost my mind. And if you can't, then they strip the title and redistribute the remaining assets to a distant cousin who will actually behave like proper nobility. The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Eve spoke. When do you have to go? 3 days. Are you going to? Alexander looked at her. Really looked at her. And Eve saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of options, the assessment of consequences. I don't know. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. He left the office. Eve watched him go, feeling something twist in her chest. He's going to leave, Thomas said quietly. You don't know that. I know that look. I've seen it before. He's already calculating how to minimize damage, how to walk away from this without destroying everything. He's not walking away. Then why did that feel like goodbye? Eve didn't have an answer. Alexander spent the next 2 days in a state of careful withdrawal, still working at the clinic but with a distance that hadn't been there before. Still polite, still competent, but present in the way someone is when they're already halfway gone. Eve recognized the pattern, had seen it in her own behavior during the final months of their marriage when she'd started emotionally preparing for escape. On the second night, she found him in the clinic after everyone else had left, sitting in the dark office staring at paperwork he wasn't actually reading. She didn't announce herself, just sat down across from him and waited. Finally, he spoke. I have to go back. I know. If I don't, they'll strip everything. The title, the assets, the remaining influence I have. Everything I've been using to fund this work. Okay. And if they strip it all, I can't help anymore. Can't fund clinics or rebuild neighborhoods or pressure factory owners into better conditions. I become just another person without resources or power. Eve studied him in the darkness. Is that what you're afraid of? Losing power? No. Alexander's voice was raw. I'm afraid of becoming useless. You work with your hands now. You treat patients. You're not useless. I'm useful because I have resources to deploy, because my name still means something. Take that away and I'm just a man who learned to clean wounds. There are thousands of those. Only one of me. So this is about ego. This is about impact. Alexander met her eyes. I can do more good as a duke who's reformed than as a commoner with medical training. That's just math. And what happens when you go back to London? When you're surrounded by people who think this was a temporary crisis of conscience? I don't know. You'll slip back. You'll remember how much easier it is to write checks than to actually show up. How much more comfortable it is to govern poverty from a distance than to live inside it. You think that's who I am? Someone who'd abandon this the moment it got inconvenient? I think you're human. And humans default to comfort when pressure's applied. I've watched it happen 1,000 times. I'm not them. Aren't you? Eve's voice was harder than she intended. You showed up here running from guilt, from the horror of almost dying, from finally seeing what your indifference cost. But guilt fades. Horror becomes memory. And comfort is seductive. So you don't believe I've changed. I believe you've changed for 6 months. That's different than permanent transformation. The words hung between them like an accusation. Alexander was quiet for a long time. Then he stood. I need to think. He walked out. Eve sat alone in the dark office, feeling like she'd just destroyed something irreplaceable. But she couldn't take the words back. Couldn't pretend she wasn't terrified that Alexander would return to London and disappear back into aristocratic comfort, leaving her alone again with the memory of what might have been. The third morning came too fast. Alexander appeared at the clinic before dawn, dressed in clothes Eve hadn't seen him wear since he'd arrived. Expensive fabric, tailored cuts, the uniform of his class. He looked like Duke Whitmore again. Like the man she'd married. Like someone already gone. I'm leaving for London this morning, he said. His voice was formal. Careful. The trial is in 3 days. I know. I'll be back. Will you? Eve. There was something desperate in how he said her name. I'm coming back. People always say that. I mean it. So did you when you married me? When you promised fidelity and partnership and all those other lies we told in front of the Archbishop. The hit landed hard. Eve saw Alexander flinch. That was different. Was it? Or are you just better at convincing yourself now? I love you. The words dropped into the space between them like stones into deep water. Eve felt them land, felt the impact reverberate through her entire body. What? I love you. Alexander's voice was steady despite the tremor underneath. I didn't plan to, didn't think I was capable of it. But watching you work, watching you care, watching you build something real out of wreckage, I fell in love with you. The actual you. Not the woman I married, not the performance, not the idea. You. Eve couldn't breathe. Say something, Alexander said. You don't get to do this. Her voice was shaking. You don't get to walk away and drop that on me like it changes anything. It changes everything. No, it makes it worse. Because now I have to watch you leave knowing you actually mean it this time. Knowing you're choosing duty over us. Again. I'm not choosing duty. I'm choosing impact. I'm choosing the ability to actually help people instead of just being one more set of hands. You're choosing comfort. You're choosing to go back where things make sense instead of staying where they're hard. Alexander stepped closer. His expression was open in a way she'd never seen during their marriage. Raw and desperate and completely undefended. If I thought staying here was the right choice, I'd stay. But Eve, they will strip everything. And without resources, I can't do a fraction of what needs doing. I can't fund hospitals or pressure factory owners or change policy. I become irrelevant. You're already relevant. You matter to the people here. I matter to 50 people. As a duke, I can impact 50,000. And when you're back in London being impactful, where does that leave me? Here. Doing the work you've always done. Making the difference you've always made. Alone. The word came out smaller than she intended. Alexander's expression cracked. Come with me. Eve stared at him. What? Come to London. Testify at the trial. Tell them what I've been doing. Show them this isn't a crisis of conscience. It's a genuine transformation. Help me keep the title so I can keep funding this work. You want me to save your reputation. I want you beside me. As what? Your voucher? Your proof of change? The charitable project that demonstrates your commitment to the poor? As my partner? As the woman I love? as someone who actually understands what I'm trying to build. Eve felt fury rise in her chest, hot and consuming. You left me alone for 3 years. You made me invisible. You destroyed every version of myself I might have become. And now you want me to perform for aristocrats so you can keep your title? No. That's exactly what this is. You need me to be useful, to be evidence, to stand there and smile and explain that Duke Whitmore has really changed this time. Look, he even fell in love with his ex-wife. Isn't that proof of genuine transformation? It's not performance. Everything in your world is performance, Alexander. That's the poison you can't get out. You think you've changed, but you're still measuring impact in numbers and influence instead of actual human connection. That's not fair. Fair? Eve's voice rose. Fair is not being asked to sacrifice myself again for your redemption arc. Fair is not having to choose between my work and being your prop. Fair is you actually choosing me for once instead of whatever looks best on paper. I am choosing you. No. You're choosing the version of yourself that gets to keep being powerful, and you want me to validate that choice. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Alexander spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You're right. What? You're right. I'm asking you to sacrifice your work to save mine. Asking you to perform for people who treated you like furniture. Asking you to be useful instead of being loved. His expression was devastated. I'm still doing it. Still making you smaller so I can stay large. Eve felt something break inside her chest, because she'd expected him to argue, to defend himself, to prove he hadn't actually changed. But this raw admission of exactly what he was asking was worse, because it meant he knew, understood, and was asking anyway. I can't come to London, she said quietly. I can't be that person again. I know. So this is it. I don't want it to be, but it is. Eve felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. Because you're leaving, and I'm staying. And whatever this was, it's over. Alexander reached for her hand. She let him take it, let him hold it like something precious. I will come back, he said. I swear to you, Eve, I will do whatever it takes to keep the title, and I will come back. And if you can't keep it, then I'll come back anyway. Without resources, without power, just me. Eve wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this time would be different. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She pulled her hand away. Goodbye, Alexander. She walked out before he could respond. Before the tears she'd been fighting could break free. Before she could change her mind and agree to sacrifice herself one more time for a man who'd already taken 3 years of her life. She made it to the storage room before she broke. Thomas found her there 20 minutes later, sitting on the floor among medical supplies, crying in a way she hadn't let herself cry since the night Alexander had walked out of their anniversary celebration. He sat down beside her without speaking. Just present, just there. Finally, Eve spoke. He's gone. I know. He said he loved me. I know that too. How? Everyone knew, Cooper. Everyone except apparently you two. Eve let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He wants me to go to London, to help him keep his title, to be his proof of transformation. Are you going? No? Why not? Because I can't be that person anymore. Can't sacrifice my work for his. Can't perform for people who never saw me as human. Even if it means losing him? Even then. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, you love him too. Yes, and you're letting him go anyway. Yes, that's the bravest thing I've ever seen. Eve didn't feel brave, felt like she was tearing herself apart. But she'd learned something in the years since leaving Alexander the first time. Sometimes survival meant choosing yourself even when it broke you. Alexander left Manchester that afternoon without seeing her again. Eve threw herself into work with an intensity that worried even Thomas. 70-hour weeks. Patients treated with mechanical efficiency. No breaks, no rest, no processing of the emotions churning underneath. 3 days passed. The day of Alexander's trial. Eve woke up that morning feeling like she was waiting for execution. Went through her routine on autopilot. Treated patients without really seeing them. Thomas finally intervened around noon. Go to London. What? You're useless here. You're distracted and miserable and you're going to hurt someone because you can't focus. So go to London. I told him no. I know what you told him. I'm telling you to go anyway. Why? Because you're going to regret it if you don't. Because whatever happens at that trial is going to haunt you. Because you love him and he loves you, and sometimes that actually matters more than pride. It's not about pride. Then what is it about? Survival. Eve's voice cracked. I survived him once. I built myself back from nothing. If I go back, if I help him, if we try again and it fails, I won't survive it twice. Thomas studied her with uncommon seriousness. You're right, you might not, but you're also not surviving this. You're just existing, going through motions, running from something that's already caught you. That's not fair. True things usually aren't. He stood. There's a train to London in 2 hours. I can cover your patience. Go or don't, but make an actual choice instead of just defaulting to fear. He walked out. Eve sat alone in the office for 90 minutes, thinking about Alexander burning in that building to save children he didn't know, about his hands holding hers after the fire, about 6 months of watching him transform from someone she hated into someone she loved, about the look on his face when he'd said, I love you, about what she'd told him during their marriage, you killed me, about whether she was brave enough to risk being killed again. With 15 minutes until the train left, Eve made her decision. She grabbed her coat and ran. The journey to London took 4 hours. Eve spent them in a state of sustained panic, second-guessing everything, wondering if she was making a catastrophic mistake. But she didn't turn back. The trial was being held at Westminster, in one of those oppressively formal rooms designed to make people feel small. Eve arrived with 10 minutes to spare, wearing a simple dress she'd borrowed from one of the clinic's nurses because she'd left Manchester with nothing but the clothes she'd been working in. A guard tried to stop her at the door. She pushed past him. The room was full of aristocrats and officials, and people whose entire existence revolved around maintaining social order. At the front, seated in what looked like a defendant's chair, was Alexander. He looked exhausted, defeated, like a man who'd already lost. Until he saw her. Their eyes met across the room, and Eve watched shock register on his face. Then something else. Something that looked like hope. The trial had already started. Some pompous official was reading charges, dereliction of duty, inappropriate use of title, conduct unbecoming of nobility. Eve walked down the center aisle while people stared, reached the front, looked at the panel of judges, older men in ceremonial robes, the kind of people who'd never worked a day in their lives and wouldn't recognize sacrifice if it burned them. She turned to face them. My name is Eve Cooper. I used to be Lady Evelyn Whitmore before Duke Alexander discarded me. And I'm here to tell you exactly what kind of man he is. The room went silent. One of the judges, an elderly man with cold eyes, leaned forward. This is highly irregular. So is stripping a title from someone who's actually using it to help people. But here we are. Young woman, you will address this panel with respect or be removed. Eve met his gaze without flinching. I'll address this panel with honesty, which is more respect than most of you have earned. The shock on their faces would have been funny if the stakes weren't so high. Eve continued before they could recover. 3 years ago, Alexander Whitmore married me for political advantage, spent our entire marriage ignoring me, made me invisible in my own life. Then he walked out of our anniversary celebration with another woman in front of 300 witnesses. She paused. So when I tell you he's changed, understand that I have every reason to lie. Every reason to stand here and tell you he's exactly the same selfish aristocrat he's always been. Alexander was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. But he's not. Eve's voice was steady. He spent 6 months working in Manchester's worst districts, treating patients nobody else will touch, funding clinics that save lives every single day, using his resources and his name to force factory owners into better conditions. He's not playing at charity. He's doing the actual work. This is quite the testament, one of the judges said dryly, from his former wife. I'm not his former wife. I'm a doctor who's watched him transform, who's seen him run into burning buildings, who's watched him choose impact over comfort repeatedly. She looked directly at Alexander. And who's watched him become the kind of man who actually deserves the title you're considering stripping? The room was dead silent. Then the lead judge spoke. Dr. Cooper, do you believe Duke Whitmore's transformation is genuine? Eve took a breath. Yes. And if we allow him to retain his title, do you believe he'll continue this work? I believe he'll do it either way. But with the title, he can do more. He can change systems instead of just treating symptoms. He can force accountability from people who currently face none. She paused. The question isn't whether he's genuine. It's whether you value actual results over aristocratic performance. The judge studied her for a long moment. Thank you for your testimony. You may step down. Eve turned to leave, caught Alexander's eyes again, saw something in them that made her chest tight. She walked back up the aisle while the trial continued behind her, found a bench outside the chamber and sat down, shaking. She'd just testified, had just defended the man who'd destroyed her, had just potentially saved the title he might use to build something better, or might use to slip back into comfort. She didn't know which. 2 hours later, the doors opened and people began filing out. Eve watched them pass, aristocrats discussing dinner plans, officials comparing notes, the entire machinery of privilege grinding forward. Then Alexander appeared. He looked wrecked, walked toward her slowly like he didn't trust his own legs. Eve stood. What happened? They're allowing me to keep the title. Conditional on demonstrated continued commitment to reform work. They'll review again in a year. So you won. We won. Alexander stopped in front of her. You saved me. I told the truth. You didn't have to come. I know. Why did you? Eve studied him. This man she'd married and hated and maybe loved. This person who'd transformed in ways she'd thought impossible. This human who was still flawed and still trying and still choosing to show up. Because I'm tired of running, tired of protecting myself from possibilities that might hurt me, tired of surviving instead of living. Alexander reached for her hand. She let him take it. I meant what I said, he told her quietly. I love you, and I'm going to spend whatever time you'll give me proving it's not just words. How? By staying, by working, by choosing you over comfort every single day until you believe me. And if I can't believe you, then I'll keep trying anyway. Eve felt something in her chest unlock. Some defense she'd been holding for 6 months, for 3 years, maybe for her entire life. Okay. I'll try. We'll try. Eve met his eyes. But if you slip back, if you choose comfort over us, I'm done. No second chances after this. Understood. And I'm not moving to London. I'm not giving up my work. If this is going to work, you come to Manchester. I'll come to Manchester. You're sure? Because that means giving up most of what you just fought to keep. It means choosing me over influence. I'm choosing both. I'll use the title from Manchester. I'll work at the clinic and push for policy changes. I'll figure out how to be Duke Whitmore and your partner simultaneously. That's impossible. Probably. Alexander smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. But I've gotten good at impossible things lately. Despite everything, Eve smiled back. Eve. They stood there in Westminster's corridor holding hands, looking at each other like people who'd survived something catastrophic and come out the other side changed. Then Alexander pulled her close. Eve let herself be held, let herself feel safe in arms that had once felt like a cage. Let herself hope that maybe, impossibly, people could actually transform. That maybe she could too. They stayed like that for a long time, while London moved around them, while the future waited, uncertain and terrifying and potentially beautiful. And for the first time in years, Eve wasn't running towards something or away from it. She was just standing still, choosing to stay, choosing to try, choosing to believe that sometimes broken things could be rebuilt into something stronger than they'd been before. The train back to Manchester left that evening. They took it together, sat across from each other in an empty compartment while countryside rolled past the windows, talking about logistics and plans and how to make this impossible thing actually work. But underneath the practical conversation was something else, something fragile and new and worth protecting. Around midnight, Eve moved to sit beside him. Alexander put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him, felt his breath steady, felt her own heart slow to match his rhythm, felt, for the first time since she'd walked out of the Whitmore estate 3 years ago, like she was exactly where she belonged. The train pulled into Manchester just before dawn. They walked to the clinic together through streets just starting to wake, past factories firing up for the day, past workers heading to shifts that would destroy their bodies, past the poverty Alexander had once governed from a distance and now lived inside. Thomas was already there when they arrived, looked up from the patient he was treating, saw them walk in together, smiled. Welcome back, Cooper. Good to be back. Duke. Thomas nodded at Alexander. Dr. Brennan, you staying this time? Yeah, I'm staying. Good. We're short-staffed and I'm exhausted. Thomas turned back to his patient. There's an amputation scheduled in an hour if you want to assist. Alexander looked at Eve. She looked back. And in that moment, Eve knew they were going to be okay. Not perfect, not easy, but okay. Because they were both staying, both showing up, both choosing this difficult, imperfect, necessary work, both choosing each other. Finally. But as Eve scrubbed in for the amputation an hour later, standing beside Alexander in the small surgery room they'd converted from a storage closet, she felt something shift. A knock at the clinic's main door. Heavy. Official. Thomas went to answer it. Eve heard voices. Heard Thomas's tone shift from casual to cautious. Then he appeared in the doorway. Cooper. You need to see this. We're about to start surgery. Now. Something in his voice made Eve's stomach drop. She followed him to the front, found 3 men in expensive clothes standing in the clinic's waiting area. Lawyers, from the look of them. The lead one stepped forward. Dr. Eve Cooper? Yes. I represent the Carter family. Your father specifically. Eve's blood went cold. What does he want? He's filing suit. Claims you abandoned your duties as his daughter. Claims the marriage to Duke Whitmore was never legally dissolved. Claims you're mentally unfit and requests legal conservatorship to ensure proper medical treatment. The words hit like physical blows. He can't do that. He can, and he is. The lawyer handed her an official-looking document. You're required to appear in London for evaluation in 3 days. If you refuse, the court will issue a warrant. Eve stared at the paper, at the reality crashing down around her. Her father, using the legal system to force her back into the life she'd escaped, to declare her incompetent, to erase everything she'd built. And there was nothing she could do about it. Behind her, she heard Alexander's voice. What's happening? Thomas explained while Eve stood frozen. Then Alexander's hand was on her shoulder. We'll fight this. Eve turned to look at him, saw the determination in his expression, but also saw the truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Her father had resources, had connections, had the entire weight of aristocratic England behind him, and she was just a woman who'd run away. Just a doctor without credentials, just someone who dared to choose herself over duty. The system was designed to crush people like her, and it was about to succeed. Eve read the document 3 times while her hands shook so badly the paper rattled. Each word was a carefully crafted weapon designed to dismantle everything she'd built. Mental instability, abandonment of familial duty, failure to honor marriage contract. Her father's lawyers had constructed a legal cage that would drag her back to a life that had nearly killed her the first time. Alexander took the document from her trembling fingers. Read it with the same cold precision he'd once used to plan military campaigns. His expression went from determined to dangerous in the span of 3 paragraphs. This is insane. They're claiming you're incompetent because you chose to practice medicine instead of attending tea parties. It's not insane. Eve's voice was hollow. It's the system working exactly as designed. Women who step out of line get declared unfit, get forced back into control. My father's been waiting for an opening like this. Then we fight it. With what? I have no legal standing, no credentials they'll recognize, no husband to speak for me because we're divorced. She laughed, bitter and broken. I'm exactly what they say I am in their eyes. A runaway wife, a woman playing at being a doctor, someone who needs to be managed. The lawyer cleared his throat. If you fail to appear, Miss Cooper, the court will rule in your father's favor by default. You'll be remanded to his custody and committed for evaluation at an institution of his choosing. An institution. The word landed like a physical blow. Eve had seen those places, had treated women who'd been locked away for crimes like reading too much, or refusing unwanted marriages, or simply being inconvenient. Once inside, there was no getting out. Not without a man's signature authorizing release. Her father wouldn't just lock her away. He'd erase her, delete Eve Cooper entirely, and resurrect Evelyn Carter as a cautionary tale about the dangers of female independence. Alexander's voice cut through her spiraling panic. When's the hearing? 3 days. London. We'll be there. The lawyer's expression suggested he found Alexander's confidence amusing. I should inform you, Duke Whitmore, that your testimony may not carry the weight you expect. Given your own recent difficulties with the Crown and your previous failure as Miss Cooper's husband, the court may view your support as further evidence of her poor judgment. Alexander stepped forward, close enough that the lawyer had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. Get out of my clinic. This is not your... It became mine the moment you walked in here threatening the woman I love. So you can leave on your feet or leave on a stretcher. Your choice. The lawyer's smugness cracked. He gathered his papers quickly. 3 days, Miss Cooper. Don't make this worse by running. They left. Eve stood motionless while Thomas locked the door behind them. Stood there while Alexander tried to speak to her and she couldn't process words. Stood there while everything she'd fought to build collapsed around her. Finally, she found her voice. I have to run. Eve, I have to disappear. Change my name again. Leave England entirely if necessary. Because if I go to that hearing, I lose. My father has money and connections and an entire legal system designed to prove women like me incompetent. So we get better lawyers, we build a case. With what evidence? That I'm a good doctor? They won't care. That I've built a life? They'll call it delusion. That I left an abusive marriage? They'll say I abandoned my duty. She met his eyes. There is no winning this, Alexander. The game is rigged. Then we change the game. You can't change centuries of law in 3 days. Alexander's expression went cold and calculating, the same look she'd seen when he was planning how to fund the clinic's expansion, when he was strategizing how to pressure factory owners into better conditions, the look of a man who'd learned to weaponize his privilege for something other than maintaining power. No, but I can use what I have. Title, connections. The fact that I just won my own trial and half of England's aristocracy is watching to see what I do next. What are you planning? I'm going to make this so publicly ugly that your father wishes he'd never filed. That's not a plan. That's suicide. You'll destroy whatever credibility you have left. Good. Alexander's voice was flat. Because if I can't use that credibility to protect you, it's worthless anyway. Eve stared at him. At this man who'd once valued reputation above everything, now volunteering to burn it all down. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do. He reached for her hand. Because you were right 3 years ago. I killed you. I married you, and I made you invisible, and I let you suffer in silence because acknowledging your pain would have been inconvenient. I don't get to make that mistake twice. This is different. No, it's exactly the same. Powerful men using systems to control women who threaten their authority. Your father's doing to you what I did for 3 years, treating you like property instead of a person. And I'll be damned if I stand by and watch it happen again. Thomas had been listening silently. Now he spoke. What do you need? Alexander turned to him. A complete medical record. Every patient Eve's treated. Every procedure she's performed. Testimony from nurses, other doctors, anyone who's worked with her. I want documentation proving she's not just competent, but exceptional. That won't be enough. It'll be a start. Alexander's mind was clearly racing. Then I need character witnesses. People she's helped. Families she's saved. I want a courtroom so full of evidence that calling her incompetent becomes obviously absurd. They'll still rule against her. The law's on her father's side. Then I'll change the law. Eve felt something crack in her chest, something that felt like hope and terror combined. You can't... Watch me. The next 72 hours were brutal. Alexander deployed every connection he'd spent 6 months cultivating, called in favors from reformist politicians, contacted journalists who'd covered his transformation, built a coalition of people who owed him either money or loyalty or both. Eve worked beside him while also maintaining her clinic schedule because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant drowning. She documented cases, wrote detailed accounts of treatments, gathered testimony from patients who wouldn't normally have access to legal proceedings. Thomas coordinated logistics with a precision that suggested he'd missed his calling as a military strategist. But underneath the frantic preparation, Eve felt the weight of inevitability. Because systems this old, this entrenched, didn't change because one duke decided to make noise. They adapted. They absorbed resistance. They crushed people who got too loud. She'd watched it happen 1,000 times. The morning of the hearing arrived too fast. Eve dressed in the same borrowed clothes she'd worn to Alexander's trial. Simple, plain, the opposite of what Evelyn Carter would have worn. Alexander appeared in clothes that split the difference between aristocrat and reformer, expensive enough to command respect, simple enough to suggest he'd moved beyond pure vanity. Ready? No, me neither. They took the train to London together, sat in tense silence while countryside gave way to industrial sprawl, gave way to the city's heart. The hearing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon at a courthouse Eve remembered from her previous life. She'd attended functions there, charity events, the kind of performative justice where wealthy people congratulated themselves for caring about the poor while doing nothing structural to help them. Now she was the one being judged. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. Eve recognized faces from her father's social circle. Lawyers, aristocrats, people who'd known her as Lady Whitmore and were clearly enjoying watching her brought low. But there were also others, factory workers in their best clothes, nurses from St. Bartholomew's, patients from the Manchester Clinic, people who'd taken time off work they couldn't afford to lose to sit in a courtroom and bear witness. Alexander had built an army. Eve's father sat at the plaintiff's table with his legal team, Lord Henry Carter, industrial magnate, a man who'd built an empire on the backs of workers he viewed as machinery, who'd raised his daughter to be ornamental and was now punishing her for becoming functional. He looked at Eve with an expression that might have been concern if she didn't know him better, if she hadn't grown up learning to read the calculation behind every gesture. He was performing grief, performing the devoted father trying to save his troubled daughter, and the judge, an elderly man who'd probably attended school with her father, was buying it completely. The proceedings began with her father's lawyer presenting the case. Evelyn Carter had abandoned her family, had violated the terms of her marriage, had demonstrated clear signs of mental instability by choosing to work in squalid conditions despite her aristocratic upbringing. Eve sat and listened to her life dismantled into evidence of incompetence. Then it was Alexander's turn. He stood, walked to the front of the courtroom with the same confidence he'd once used to command troops. Your Honor, the court is being asked to declare Dr. Eve Cooper incompetent. I'd like to submit evidence to the contrary. The judge looked skeptical. You may proceed, Duke Whitmore, though I must note your own recent difficulties suggest perhaps limited judgment on this matter. Noted. Alexander didn't flinch. Over the past 2 years, Dr. Cooper has treated over 3,000 patients in some of England's most underserved communities. She's performed surgeries that saved lives. She's trained other medical professionals. She's built clinics from nothing. That's not the question before this court, her father's lawyer interrupted. The question is whether she's mentally fit to make decisions for herself. She's proven her fitness by building a medical practice more effective than most formally credentialed doctors. Without proper credentials. Without oversight. With results. Alexander's voice cut through the objection like a blade. She has documentation of every case, testimony from colleagues, patients willing to speak to her competence, anecdotal evidence from the very people she's deluded. Then let's talk about measurable outcomes. Infection rates at Dr. Cooper's clinic are 30% lower than London's best hospitals. Mortality rates are half the national average. Patient satisfaction is... The judge interrupted. Duke Whitmore, while your passion is noted, this court is concerned with Miss Cooper's mental state, not her work performance. Her father contends she's suffering from delusions of competence that have led her to abandon her proper role in society. Eve felt the room tilt. Because that was the trap. It didn't matter how good she was at medicine. The question was whether wanting to practice medicine instead of being a decorative wife constituted mental illness. And in this system, it did. Alexander must have seen it too because his expression shifted. Then I'd like to call a different witness. Who? Myself. The courtroom stirred. You're already testifying, the judge said irritably. Not about Dr. Cooper's competence, about mine. The judge frowned. I don't understand. Let me clarify. Alexander's voice was calm but carrying an edge that made Eve's stomach drop. This court is being asked to determine whether a woman who chose meaningful work over aristocratic performance is mentally unfit. I'd like to submit that by that standard, I should also be declared incompetent. That's absurd, is it? I abandoned my military commission, liquidated family assets, spent months working in poverty when I could have maintained a comfortable life. By the logic being applied to Dr. Cooper, I'm clearly delusional. You're making a mockery of these proceedings. I'm pointing out the double standard. When a man rejects privilege for purpose, he's reformed. When a woman does it, she's insane. The system is rigged. The judge's face went red. Duke Whitmore, you will... What? Alexander stepped closer to the bench. Declare me in contempt? Strip my title? Go ahead. Because if this court rules that Dr. Cooper is incompetent for choosing to help people, then I want nothing to do with any system that calls itself justice. The courtroom erupted, lawyers shouting, spectators talking over each other, the judge hammering his gavel demanding order. Eve sat frozen while Alexander dismantled his own credibility to protect hers, while he proved, finally and completely, that he'd changed, because the old Alexander would never have risked this, would never have chosen her over reputation, would never have stood in front of England's legal establishment and called them corrupt. But this Alexander was doing exactly that, and it was either going to save her or destroy them both. Order. The judge's voice cut through the chaos. Duke Whitmore, you are dangerously close to contempt charges. Then charge me. But first, let me finish. The judge looked like he wanted to refuse, but too many people were watching, too many witnesses to whatever happened next. You have 2 minutes. Alexander turned to face the courtroom, to face all the aristocrats and workers, and everyone in between. Dr. Eve Cooper is the most competent person I've ever known. She rebuilt herself from wreckage. She learned medicine through pure determination. She saves lives every single day in conditions that would break most people. His voice was steady, unwavering, and this court is being asked to declare her incompetent because she refused to be ornamental, because she chose purpose over performance, because she dared to believe women could be more than property. He paused. Let the words land. If you rule against her, you're not protecting her. You're punishing her for threatening a system that benefits men like me and her father at the expense of everyone else. You're proving that this country values control over competence, power over people. Another pause. So I'm asking this court to make a choice. Uphold a law designed to silence women, or recognize that competence has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with results. Dr. Cooper has proven herself 1,000 times over. The only question is whether you're brave enough to admit it. He sat down. The silence that followed was absolute. Eve couldn't breathe, couldn't process what had just happened. Alexander had just committed professional suicide in front of half of London's elite, had just proven every single thing he'd been saying for 6 months was real. The judge looked shaken, looked at Eve's father, looked at the packed courtroom full of witnesses, looked like a man realizing he was trapped. I need to confer with my colleagues. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. The gavel came down. People started filing out. Eve sat motionless while the courtroom emptied. Alexander stayed beside her. Finally, she found her voice. You just destroyed everything. I know. Your title, your reputation, everything you fought to keep. I know. Why? He looked at her. Really looked at her. Because none of it matters if I lose you. Eve felt tears threatening but refused to let them fall. Not here, not where her father's allies could see. They sat in silence while London moved outside. While their future hung in balance, Thomas appeared in the doorway. Whatever happens, you fought, both of you. Eve nodded, unable to speak. The hour passed too slowly and too fast. Then people started filing back in. The judge returned, sat down heavily like a man carrying weight he hadn't asked for. After consultation with my colleagues and review of the evidence presented, this court has reached a decision. Eve's heart hammered against her ribs. The claim that Miss Eve Cooper is mentally incompetent is... The judge paused, looked uncomfortable, rejected. The courtroom exploded. Eve couldn't process it, couldn't believe it. However, the judge's voice cut through the noise. This court notes that Miss Cooper's marriage to Duke Whitmore was never formally dissolved. Therefore, she remains Lady Whitmore with all associated legal protections. Any future claims of incompetence would require her husband's consent, which he has made abundantly clear will not be forthcoming. Wait. Eve's mind was racing. That wasn't... The ruling stands. Lord Carter's petition is denied. This court is adjourned. The gavel came down final and absolute. Eve sat stunned while people rushed forward, while workers cheered and aristocrats looked furious and the entire room descended into chaos. She turned to Alexander. We're still married? Technically. The divorce was never finalized. I kept delaying the paperwork and then you disappeared and I never followed through. You used that. Used our marriage to protect me. I used the only leverage I had. Eve didn't know whether to laugh or scream, so she did both. Alexander pulled her close while she shook with relief and fury and a dozen emotions she couldn't name. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have asked permission before claiming you were still my wife. You saved me. I trapped you in the same system that almost destroyed you. No. Eve pulled back to look at him. You used their own weapon against them. You turned marriage from a cage into a shield. She paused. But we're getting that divorce finalized immediately. Are we? Yes. Because if we're doing this, if we're actually trying, I need it to be a choice, not a legal technicality. Understood. They stood together while the courtroom slowly emptied, while Thomas organized the witnesses who'd traveled to support them, while Eve's father sat at his table looking like a man who'd just lost something he'd thought guaranteed. Finally, he approached. Evelyn. Eve. Her father flinched at the correction. You've made your point. You've humiliated me publicly. Surely now you'll return home and we can… No. Eve's voice was flat. Final. You're still my daughter. No. I'm a doctor who happens to share your blood. That's all. You can't survive out there without family support. I've been surviving just fine for 3 years. Her father's expression hardened. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Eve stepped closer. You tried to cage me. You failed. And if you try again, I'll make sure every newspaper in England knows exactly what kind of man uses the legal system to punish his daughter for choosing purpose over performance. You wouldn't dare. Try me. They stared at each other, father and daughter, aristocrat and doctor. Two people who'd once shared a house but never actually knew each other. Finally, her father turned and walked out. Eve watched him go, felt something release in her chest, some final tie to the life she'd left behind. Thomas appeared beside them. We should get out of here before someone changes their mind. Agreed. They left the courthouse together, walked out into London afternoon light that felt sharp and clean. The workers who'd testified were waiting outside. Patients Eve had treated, people whose lives she'd saved or improved or simply made slightly less painful. They erupted into cheers when she appeared. Eve felt tears finally break free, because these people had risked jobs and time and social standing to sit in a courtroom for her, had proven that the life she'd built mattered, that she mattered. Alexander's hand found hers. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me. Finally. I should have seen you years ago, but you see me now. That's what matters. They stood there while people congratulated them, while Thomas organized transportation back to Manchester, while London moved around them indifferent to the small revolution that had just occurred in a dusty courtroom. Finally, Eve spoke again. We need to talk about the marriage thing. I know. I meant what I said. We finalized the divorce. All right. And then… She paused, trying to find words for something she'd never expected to want again. And then maybe we start over, properly this time. Meaning we date like normal people. Figure out if this works without legal contracts or family pressure or any of the things that poisoned it the first time. Alexander smiled. First actual genuine smile she'd seen from him since the trial started. I'd like that. No grand gestures, no public declarations, just two people trying to build something real. Sounds terrifying. It does. They stood there grinning at each other like idiots while Thomas shook his head. You two are ridiculous. Probably. Definitely. But Thomas was smiling too. Come on, we have a train to catch. They walked toward the station together. Three people who'd survived something catastrophic and come out the other side changed. Eve felt lighter than she had in years, free in a way she'd never experienced even after leaving her marriage the first time. Because this time she wasn't running. She was choosing her work, choosing her life, choosing Alexander, not because law demanded it, but because she actually wanted to. The train pulled into Manchester near midnight. They were exhausted and wired and too full of adrenaline to sleep. Walking back to the clinic through familiar streets felt like returning home. Thomas split off at his boarding house, promised to open the clinic in the morning so they could actually rest. Eve and Alexander walked the final blocks in comfortable silence. At the clinic's door, they stopped. So, Alexander said, how does this work? The starting over part. Slowly. Eve looked up at him. No rushing, no assuming. We figure out who we are now, and whether those people actually fit together. And if they don't, then we stay colleagues, friends maybe, but honest about it. Fair enough. Eve started to unlock the door, then stopped. Alexander, yes? Thank you for today. For all of it. You don't have to. I do. Because what you did in that courtroom, the risks you took, That was the bravest thing I've ever seen, and I need you to know it mattered. Alexander looked at her with an expression so raw it hurt. You matter, he said quietly, more than titles or reputation or anything else. You matter. Eve felt her heart do something complicated. Then she made a choice. She kissed him. Not desperate or performative or trying to prove anything, just honest. Just two people who'd survived hell and maybe, impossibly, found something worth protecting on the other side. Alexander kissed her back with a gentleness she'd never experienced from him before. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eve smiled. Slow, she reminded him. Right, slow. Starting tomorrow. Tomorrow works. They stood there in the doorway while Manchester breathed around them, while the future waited uncertain and terrifying and full of possibility. And for the first time in either of their lives, neither was afraid of what came next. But as Eve finally unlocked the door and they stepped inside, she saw something that made her blood freeze. The clinic had been ransacked, equipment destroyed, files scattered, medicine cabinets emptied or smashed. And on the wall, written in what looked like blood, a message. This is what happens to women who forget their place. Eve stood motionless while Alexander checked the rooms to make sure whoever did this was gone. He returned looking murderous. They're gone. But Eve, this wasn't random. This was a message. From my father. Probably. Eve walked through the destruction slowly, looking at years of work demolished, looking at the medical supplies they couldn't afford to replace destroyed, looking at the evidence that even winning in court didn't mean winning in reality, that powerful men who lost publicly found other ways to punish. Alexander came up behind her. We'll rebuild. No. Eve's voice was cold. Final. We don't rebuild. We finish this. What are you planning? Eve turned to look at him. At this man who'd just risked everything for her. At this partner who'd proven he'd stand beside her no matter what. I'm planning to make sure my father and every man like him understands that women who fight back don't stop just because you destroy their workspace. She paused. I'm planning to burn his empire to the ground. Alexander studied her face, saw something there that made him nod slowly. Tell me what you need. Eve smiled, sharp and dangerous and completely done with playing by rules designed to keep her powerless. Everything you have, every connection, every favor. Every ounce of influence you spent 6 months building. You're sure? I've never been more sure of anything. Alexander's expression mirrored hers, cold and determined and ready for war. Then let's go to war. They stood together in the ruins of the clinic while dawn started breaking outside, and Eve felt something ignite in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or hope or any of the fragile emotions she'd been carrying. This was rage. Pure and focused and absolutely done with being afraid. Her father wanted to remind her of her place. She was about to show him exactly what happened when you push someone with nothing left to lose. Eve spent the rest of that night documenting everything, photographing the destruction with a camera Thomas kept for medical records, cataloging every smashed bottle, every ruined instrument, every file scattered across floors now slick with wasted medicine. She worked with mechanical precision while Alexander watched her move through the wreckage like someone conducting an autopsy on her own life. This is evidence, she said when he finally asked what she was doing. When we go after him, I need proof. He won't admit to this. He doesn't have to. Eve's voice was ice. The people he hired will talk eventually. Everyone talks when the alternative is prison. You're thinking like a prosecutor. I'm thinking like someone who's done being the victim. She finished the documentation as dawn broke properly over Manchester, stood in the center of what had been her clinic and felt something harden inside her chest. Not anger anymore. Something colder. Something that understood that mercy was a luxury afforded to people who hadn't been pushed past their breaking point. Her father had just pushed her past hers. Alexander made coffee in the small kitchen that had somehow escaped destruction, brought her a cup and stood beside her surveying the damage. Where do we start? With the factories. Eve turned to look at him. Your factories. The ones you've been pressuring into better conditions. How many of them buy raw materials from Carter Industrial? Alexander's expression shifted as he followed her logic. About half. Maybe more. And if those factories suddenly refused to do business with Carter Industrial unless working conditions improved across their entire supply chain, it would cost your father millions, maybe tens of millions. Eve smiled, sharp and vicious. That's the start. You want to wage economic war. I want to use the same systems he's used to control people. Want to prove that power cuts both ways when you're arrogant enough to attack someone who has nothing left to lose. Alexander studied her face, saw something there that made him nod slowly. This won't just hurt your father. It'll hurt workers who depend on those factories for employment. I know. Eve's voice was steady, but short-term pain for long-term change. Force him to improve conditions or lose everything. Either way, workers eventually benefit. And if he doesn't bend, if he fights back, then we escalate. How far are you willing to go? Eve met his eyes. As far as it takes. They spent the next week building their campaign with the same precision Eve had once used for surgery. Alexander contacted every factory owner he'd been working with, explained the situation, made it clear that continuing business with Carter Industrial meant losing access to Whitmore funding and political support. Most of them agreed immediately. A few needed convincing. Alexander convinced them. Eve, meanwhile, reached out to journalists who'd covered the courtroom drama, fed them stories about Lord Carter's business practices, about the workers maimed in his factories, about the families destroyed by wages that wouldn't cover rent. She made sure every newspaper in England knew exactly what kind of man claimed moral authority to decide his daughter's competence. Thomas kept the clinic running from a temporary location while they orchestrated the attack. Watched Eve transform from doctor into something harder and more dangerous. "You're scaring me a little," he said one evening. "Good. I'm scaring myself. This isn't you." Eve looked up from the ledgers she'd been reviewing. Financial records Alexander had acquired through methods she'd decided not to question too closely. "How do you know?" "Maybe this is exactly who I am when people stop trying to make me small." Thomas sat down across from her. "I know you're angry. I know you have every right to be. But revenge doesn't heal anything. This isn't revenge. It's consequences. There's a difference." "Is there?" Eve set down the ledgers, looked at her friend with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and determination. "My father tried to have me declared insane for choosing meaningful work. When that failed, he destroyed the clinic where I save lives daily. He did this because he believes women exist to serve men's purposes. So yes, Thomas, there's a difference between revenge and making sure he faces actual consequences for once in his privileged life. And when you've destroyed him, what then? Then maybe other powerful men think twice before weaponizing the legal system against women who threaten their authority." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Just don't lose yourself in this. Too late." Eve returned to the ledgers. "I lost myself 3 years ago in a marriage that treated me like furniture. This is me finding a new self, one that bites back." 2 weeks into their campaign, Lord Carter's empire started showing cracks. 3 major contracts canceled, 2 factories refusing to accept shipments, stock prices dropping as rumors spread about unsafe conditions and unethical practices. Eve tracked it all with grim satisfaction. Alexander watched her become someone he'd never seen before, ruthless and brilliant and absolutely uncompromising. It should have frightened him. Instead, he found himself in awe. "You're terrifying," he told her one night. "Thank you." That wasn't a compliment. Yes, it was. Eve didn't look up from the newspaper she was reading. An article about Carter Industrial's plummeting value. "You just don't want to admit it." Alexander sat down beside her, took the newspaper from her hands. "Talk to me." "About what?" "About whether you're okay. About whether this is actually what you want, or just what you think you need to do." Eve met his eyes, saw genuine concern there, saw the man who'd stood in a courtroom and destroyed his own reputation to protect her. "I'm not okay." Her voice was quiet, raw. "I'm furious and I'm scared and I'm so tired of being powerless that I'll burn down everything to prove I'm not." "You're not powerless. You never were. Tell that to the legal system that almost locked me away. Tell that to my father who thinks destroying my life's work is an acceptable response to losing in court." "So you destroy his life's work in return?" "Yes." "And then?" Eve didn't have an answer to that, because she hadn't thought past the destruction, hadn't considered what came after revenge or consequences or whatever she was calling this campaign of calculated demolition. Alexander reached for her hand. She let him take it. "I understand the anger," he said. "I've lived in it for months. That fury at systems designed to keep some people elevated and others crushed. But Eve, at some point you have to decide whether you're fighting to change things or just fighting to hurt the people who hurt you. Can it be both?" "Yes. But one of those impulses builds something better. The other just creates more wreckage." Eve pulled her hand away. stood up and walked to the window overlooking Manchester's industrial sprawl. He tried to erase me, she said quietly. Tried to lock me away and delete everything I've become. And you're asking me to what? Forgive him? Move on? I'm asking you to think about who you want to be when this is over. Because right now you're becoming the thing you hate. Someone who uses power to crush people. That's not, isn't it? You're using economic warfare to destroy your father's business. Collateral damage be damned. That's exactly what he did to workers for decades. The comparison hit like a physical blow. Eve turned to face him, her expression cracking, showing the pain underneath the anger. Then what am I supposed to do? Just let him win? Just accept that powerful men face no consequences? No. Alexander stood and crossed to her. You make him face consequences, but you do it by building something better, not by becoming him. How? You're already doing it. The clinic, the work, the lives you save, that's what terrifies him, not economic pressure or bad press. The fact that you built a life that matters, without his permission or approval. So I should just go back to work and pretend he didn't try to destroy me? No. You should go back to work and prove that destruction doesn't work, that you're stronger than his worst attacks, that women like you don't disappear just because men like him want them to. Eve felt something break open in her chest, some knot of rage and pain she'd been carrying since the courtroom, since the clinic's destruction, since her marriage ended and she'd had to rebuild herself from wreckage. Alexander pulled her close. Let her shake against him while Manchester hummed outside. I don't know how to stop being angry, she whispered. Then don't stop. Just aim it at building instead of destroying. They stood like that for a long time. Two people who'd both been broken by systems designed to break them. Two people trying to figure out how to be whole. Finally, Eve pulled back. I need to see him. Your father? Yes. Why? Because I need him to look at me and understand that I'm not going away, that erasing me isn't an option, that every move he makes against me, I'll counter. And eventually he'll realize it's easier to leave me alone than to keep fighting. Alexander studied her face. You sure about this? No. But I'm doing it anyway. Lord Henry Carter agreed to meet his daughter at a neutral location. A private club in London where aristocrats conducted business away from public scrutiny. The kind of place Eve had attended functions as Lady Whitmore and sworn she'd never return to. But here she was. Alexander offered to come with her. Eve refused. This confrontation needed to happen alone. Needed to be about her and her father without the complication of witnesses or support. She took the train to London on a gray morning that matched her mood. Wore simple clothes that marked her as Dr. Cooper rather than Lady Whitmore. Right. Carried nothing but her anger and a clarity she'd earned through months of surviving things that should have destroyed her. The club was exactly as she remembered. Dark wood and expensive whiskey, and men congratulating themselves for being born into advantage. She walked through it like a ghost haunting her previous life. Her father was waiting in a private room, sat behind a massive desk like he was granting an audience rather than meeting his daughter. Eve didn't sit, just stood across from him and waited. Lord Carter studied her for a long moment, taking in her rough hands, her plain dress, the way she'd transformed from ornamental daughter into something harder and more functional. You've made your point, he said finally. You can work. You can survive without family support. Congratulations. Now let's discuss terms for ending this economic warfare before it costs us both more than we can afford. There are no terms. Evelyn, Eve. And I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to tell you how this ends. Her father's expression hardened. You're in no position to make demands. Actually, I'm in the perfect position. Eve's voice was calm, clinical. You tried to have me declared incompetent, failed. You destroyed my clinic. I rebuilt. You've spent 3 weeks watching your empire hemorrhage money because I have allies willing to follow my lead. So yes, father, I'm exactly in position to make demands. What do you want? I want you to leave me alone. Permanently. No more legal maneuvers, no more property destruction, no more attempts to control or erase or manage me. And in return, I stop actively dismantling your business interest. That's extortion. No, that's consequences. Eve leaned forward slightly. You spent my entire life teaching me that power was the only thing that mattered, that people were resources to be deployed. That morality was something poor people worried about because they couldn't afford actual leverage. Well, congratulations. I learned. Lord Carter's face went red. You ungrateful. Careful. Eve's voice dropped to something dangerous. You're about to say something that proves you still think of me as property, as an investment that didn't pan out. And I need you to understand something fundamental. I'm not your daughter anymore. I'm not your anything. I'm a doctor who happens to share your DNA and is willing to destroy you if you don't leave me alone. You wouldn't. I absolutely would. Eve straightened. I've already cost you millions. I can cost you everything. Factory contracts, political alliances, social standing. I have documentation of every unsafe practice in your facilities, every bribe you've paid, every corner you've cut that's cost workers their lives. You're bluffing. Try me. They stared at each other across the desk. Two people who'd once been family, now reduced to adversaries. Finally, Lord Carter spoke. You've become hard. I've become what I needed to become to survive you. That's not fair. Fair? Eve's laugh was bitter. You tried to lock me in an institution for choosing to be useful instead of ornamental. You destroyed the place where I save lives. You've spent 3 years treating my existence as an embarrassment. And you want to talk about fair? I was trying to protect you. No. You were trying to control me. There's a difference. The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken damage. Lord Carter looked older suddenly, diminished, a man realizing his power had limits he'd never acknowledged. What happened to my little girl? You killed her. Eve's voice was quiet but absolute. You raised her to be pretty and obedient, and then you married her to a man who treated her like furniture. And when she tried to become something more, you tried to erase her. So she erased herself first, became someone you couldn't control or destroy. And now she's asking you to leave her alone, to accept that she exists outside your authority, to let her build a life without interference. And if I refuse, then I keep fighting. Keep dismantling your empire piece by piece until you understand that controlling me costs more than letting me go. Lord Carter was quiet for a long time, looking at this daughter who'd transformed from ornamental socialite into something that frightened him. Finally, he nodded. Once. Sharp and bitter. You have your freedom. I always had my freedom. I'm just forcing you to acknowledge it. Eve turned to leave, stopped at the door. One more thing. The workers in your factories, the ones dying from preventable accidents and poisoning from chemical exposure. Fix it. Improve conditions. Pay living wages. Or I release every document I have to every newspaper in England. That would destroy the business. Then improve conditions. Your choice. She walked out before he could respond, before the adrenaline keeping her upright could fail. Made it to the street before her hands started shaking. She'd just faced down the man who'd shaped her entire life, had threatened him into submission, had proven she was stronger than his worst attacks. And she felt empty. Alexander was waiting at the train station when she returned to Manchester. Took one look at her face and pulled her close without asking questions. It's done, she said against his shoulder. Did he agree? He agreed. How do you feel? Eve pulled back, looked at this man who'd spent months proving people could transform, who'd destroyed his own reputation to protect her, who'd stood beside her through every impossible thing. I feel like I just won a war I never wanted to fight. That's victory for you, is it? Because I don't feel victorious? I feel tired and angry and like I've become someone I don't recognize. Alexander studied her face. Then, come with me. Where? You'll see. They walked through Manchester as evening fell, past factories shutting down for the night, past workers heading to homes that were barely adequate, past the poverty that never stopped needing attention. Alexander led her to a building she'd never seen before. New construction, still unfinished but clearly taking shape. What is this? Your clinic. The real one. He gestured at the structure rising from dirt. 3 floors, proper examination rooms, surgery facilities, space for medical training. Everything you've needed but couldn't afford. I can't afford this either. You're not paying for it. I am. Alexander looked at her. Along with about 20 other people you've helped over the past 2 years. Turns out when you save someone's life, they remember. When you treat them with dignity, they want to give back. Eve stared at the building, at this impossible gift rising from wreckage. How long have you been planning this? Since the night your clinic was destroyed. I called in every favor, liquidated more assets, built a coalition of people who believe in what you're doing. Alexander, you said you wanted to build instead of destroy. This is how. This is proof that creation is stronger than demolition. that the work matters more than revenge. Eve felt tears finally break free. Not from sadness or anger, but from something she couldn't name. Relief, maybe. Or the realization that she hadn't lost herself in the fight, that she was still someone capable of building. Alexander held her while she cried, while months of pressure and pain and rage finally released. When she could speak again, her voice was raw. "Thank you. You don't have to—" "Yes, I do. Because you just gave me back something I thought I'd lost. Hope, maybe. Or purpose. Or just the belief that good things can still happen. They always could. You just had to survive long enough to see them." They stood there while Manchester transformed from day to night, while the building that would become Eve's clinic stood half-finished but promising. "What happens now?" Eve asked. "Now, we finish this. We open the clinic. We keep doing the work. We prove that your father's attacks failed not because you fought back, but because you built something stronger than he could destroy. And us?" Alexander pulled back to look at her. "That's your call." Eve studied his face. This man who'd been a stranger in their marriage and a partner in everything since. This person who'd proven transformation wasn't just possible but sustainable. "I meant what I said about starting over." "I know. So let's do it properly. Dating, getting to know each other, building something real without legal contracts or family pressure. I'd like that. No guarantees, no assumptions. Just two people trying to figure out if they actually fit. Sounds terrifying." "It does." Alexander smiled. Then, "I love you." Still, more now than when I first said it, Eve felt her heart do something complicated. Because she loved him too. Had maybe started loving him somewhere between watching him clean bedpans and seeing him run into burning buildings and listening to him destroy his reputation to protect hers. But love wasn't enough. Love was just the starting point. The real work was building something sustainable from it. "I love you too," she said, "but I need you to understand that I'm not the woman you married. I'm harder now, more difficult, less willing to compromise myself for comfort." "Good. I don't want the woman I married. I want the woman standing in front of me, the one who survived impossible things and built meaning from wreckage. Even if that woman bites back?" Especially then. They kissed there in the shadow of the rising clinic. Kissed like people who'd earned each other through surviving hell separately and choosing each other anyway. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eve smiled. "So, where do we go from here? We go to work, we build the clinic, we help people, and we figure out this relationship thing as we go. No grand plan, no plan at all. Just commitment to showing up." Eve nodded. "That I can do." They walked back toward temporary clinic space hand in hand while Manchester settled into night. Two people who'd been broken and rebuilt. Two people who'd learned that transformation wasn't a destination, but a continuous choice. The new clinic took 4 months to complete. Eve worked alongside construction crews during the day and treated patients in makeshift facilities at night. Alexander split his time between Manchester and London, using his title to pressure policy changes while maintaining his commitment to ground-level work. Thomas coordinated everything with a competence that made them both grateful they'd kept him around. The opening was small. No aristocratic donors. No publicity. Just the people who'd be using the facility, workers and their families, gathered in the main examination room while Eve stood in front of them feeling simultaneously proud and terrified. "This clinic exists because people believed it should," she said. "Because workers deserve healthcare that doesn't bankrupt them. Because preventable suffering is unacceptable. Because every person matters regardless of class or gender or whether they're convenient to the powerful." She paused, looking at faces she recognized, people she'd treated, lives she'd saved or improved or simply made slightly less painful. "I won't promise miracles, but I promise this space will always treat you with dignity. We'll always prioritize your health over profit. We'll always see you as human beings worthy of care." The applause was genuine, warm, the sound of people who'd been invisible their entire lives finally being seen. Alexander watched from the back of the room, watched Eve in her element, watched her command attention not through title or performance, but through sheer competence and care, watched the woman he loved become everything she'd been prevented from being. Thomas appeared beside him. "You did good, Duke, we did good. Mostly her, though." "Yeah, mostly her." They stood in comfortable silence while Eve finished her speech and people began exploring the new facilities. "You staying in Manchester?" Thomas asked. Long as she'll have me. And the title? The London Obligations? I'm figuring out how to be both. Duke and doctor, aristocrat and reformer. Turns out you can hold contradictions if you're committed to making them functional. Thomas smiled. Philosophical, practical. Alexander watched Eve demonstrate new surgical equipment to a group of nurses. I spent 30 years being one-dimensional, being just a duke, just a soldier, just a hollow man performing privilege. I'm done with that. So what are you now? Still figuring it out, but someone better than I was. The clinic became exactly what Eve had envisioned, a place where workers got treatment without judgment or bankruptcy, where medical students learned that competence mattered more than credentials, where women interested in medicine found mentorship instead of dismissal. Eve ran it with the same fierce commitment she applied to everything. 12-hour days minimum, every patient treated personally, no cutting corners, no compromising standards. Alexander worked alongside her when he wasn't in London pushing for factory reforms and worker protections. They fell into a rhythm that worked, professional partners during the day, something more private at night. They were careful with each other, testing boundaries, learning who they'd become separately to understand who they might become together. 6 months after the clinic opened, Alexander asked the question they'd been dancing around. Should we get married? Eve looked up from the medical journal she'd been reading. They were in her small apartment above the clinic, evening light coming through windows overlooking Manchester. We're already married, technically. The divorce finalized last month. You signed the papers. Right. She set down the journal. So this is a proposal? More of a question. We've been doing this for months, building something real. I love you. You love me. Marriage seems like a logical next step. Eve studied his face, saw the nervousness underneath the casual phrasing. No. Alexander blinked. No? No. I don't want to get married again. Don't want legal contracts or formal ceremonies or any of the machinery that made us both miserable the first time. Then what do you want? This. Eve gestured at the space between them. What we have now. Partnership without paperwork, commitment without contracts. Just two people choosing each other every day because we actually want to, not because law requires it. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. I can live with that. You're sure? Because society expects, society can go to hell. I spent 30 years doing what society expected. Look how that turned out. Eve smiled back. Okay then. Okay. They sat there in comfortable silence. Two people who'd learned that the most radical thing you could do was build a life that prioritized being real over being respectable. A year after the clinic opened, Eve received a letter. Plain envelope. No return address. She opened it carefully, half expecting another legal threat. Inside was a single sheet of paper with handwriting she recognized. Her father's. The letter was brief, almost terse. Working conditions at Carter Industrial have improved per your demands. Wages increased 20%. Safety equipment mandatory. No worker deaths in 8 months. I still think you're wrong about most things, but perhaps not everything. The words felt dragged from him, but they were there. Eve read it twice, then set it aside. Alexander found her staring out the window later that evening. You all right? My father wrote. Admitted he made changes. Almost apologized. That's something. Is it? Eve turned to look at him. Because I don't feel victorious. I feel like I strong-armed a bitter old man into basic human decency, and that's supposed to be progress. It is progress. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. People like your father don't change easily. The fact that he changed at all means you won. Then why doesn't it feel like winning? Because real change never does. It just feels like survival with slightly better conditions. Eve absorbed this, the truth of it settling into her bones. You've gotten philosophical in your old age. I've had a good teacher. He pulled her close. They stood there while Manchester hummed below, while the clinic operated without them for once, while the future stretched out uncertain but no longer terrifying. What would you tell the woman who walked into that hospital 3 years ago? Alexander asked quietly. Eve thought about it. About that broken person fleeing a life that had tried to erase her. About the doctor she'd become through pure determination. About everything she'd survived and built. I tell her that she's stronger than she knows. That the work matters more than the wounds. That transformation is possible even when it feels impossible. She paused. and that the man who destroyed her is going to spend years proving he can build instead. Does he succeed? Eve looked up at him, at this person who'd transformed as radically as she had, who'd proven that people could choose to become better versions of themselves. Yeah, he succeeds. They kissed there in the window while Manchester settled into night, while the clinic they'd built together stood as evidence that broken things could be remade into something stronger. Later, lying in bed while Alexander slept beside her, Eve thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the woman she'd been. Invisible, ornamental, slowly dying inside a marriage that treated her like furniture. About the woman she'd become, scarred, competent, powerful in ways that had nothing to do with title or wealth. About the price of transformation and whether it had been worth it. The answer came easily. Yes. Every painful step, every moment of terror or rage or desperate reinvention, all of it worth it to become someone real. She fell asleep to the sound of Manchester breathing outside and Alexander breathing beside her. Fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would bring patients who needed help and systems that needed changing and the endless work of building something better from the wreckage powerful people created. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, with scars that proved she'd survived, with purpose that proved she mattered, with love that proved people could actually change if they were brave enough to try. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 5 years later, Dr. Eve Cooper stood in front of Parliament arguing for worker protection legislation. Stood there in simple clothes with rough hands and undeniable competence. Stood there representing thousands of workers who'd never had representation before. Beside her, Duke Alexander Whitmore testified about factory conditions he'd witnessed firsthand, about workers he'd treated alongside his partner, about the economic and moral necessity of treating human beings with dignity. The legislation passed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to force change. Afterward, they walked through London together. Two people who'd learned that real power wasn't about control, but about showing up consistently for what mattered. Think we made a difference? Eve asked. We made a start. That's all anyone can do. They stopped at a cafe, ordered coffee, sat across from each other in comfortable familiarity. You know what's strange? Alexander said. I spent 30 years terrified of losing power. Losing status, losing everything that made me important. And now I've lost most of it and I've never been happier. That's because you traded empty power for actual purpose. When did you get so wise? Eve smiled. Somewhere between saving your life and letting you save mine. They sat there while London moved around them, while the future waited with all its uncertainty and promise. And for the first time in either of their lives, neither was afraid of what came next. Because they'd learned the secret that terrifies powerful people and liberates everyone else. That you don't need permission to matter, you just need to show up. Do the work, choose to be human instead of performing it. And sometimes, impossibly, other people show up beside you, and you build something real together from the wreckage. And that's how the world actually changes. Not through grand gestures or perfect plans, but through broken people choosing to become whole. Through small acts of courage repeated until they become revolution. Through love that's earned instead of assumed. Through the stubborn, difficult, necessary work of building better when destruction would be easier. Eve and Alexander walked back to the train station hand in hand. Two people who'd survived impossible things. Two people who'd chosen each other after learning exactly who they were apart. Two people who'd proven that transformation isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more fully yourself than the world ever wanted to let you be. And that was the real victory. Not in courts or legislation or economic pressure, but in the quiet moments between two people who'd earned their right to exist. In the clinic that saved lives every day. In the workers who went home safe instead of broken. In the slow, grinding, beautiful work of making the world slightly less cruel. The train pulled into Manchester near midnight. They walked home through familiar streets. Climbed the stairs to the apartment above the clinic, fell into bed exhausted and satisfied. And in the morning, they would wake up and do it all again. Because that's what purpose looked like. Not destination, just direction, just showing up, just choosing every single day to matter. And that was enough. It was everything. It was home.